In the hidden wings of Nazi concentration camps, behind locked doors and sterile white walls, some of the darkest chapters of human history unfolded. These were not battlefields of guns and tanks, but laboratories of cruelty, places where science was twisted into a weapon and medicine became an instrument of torment. Victims were stripped not only of freedom but of dignity, as their bodies were turned into unwilling test subjects in the name of ideology, military advantage, and racial obsession. Doctors who had sworn an oath to heal instead became architects of suffering. They injected poisons into veins, froze prisoners in ice baths to study hypothermia, and deliberately spread diseases to test vaccines. Twins were dissected, women were sterilized, and countless men were mutilated in the pursuit of perverse research that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with control. For many, these experiments were not meant to cure, but to kill, slow, systematic, and cruel. What emerged from these camps was not the advancement of medicine, but its desecration. The names of doctors like Josef Mengele, Carl Clauberg, and Sigmund Rascher became synonymous with horror, their reputations forever scarred by their willingness to trade morality for ideology. Prisoners reduced to numbers on a chart, children measured as specimens, and entire populations treated as disposable subjects for experiments that mocked the very idea of humanity. Yet within this abyss there were also survivors, scarred, haunted, but determined to speak. Their testimonies revealed the details that the Nazis had tried to bury: the screams in the night, the smells of antiseptic mixed with death, the experiments conducted under the pretense of science. These stories became evidence at Nuremberg, exposing to the world how medicine had been corrupted at its very core. This is the entire story of the Nazi medical experiments, their origins, their perpetrators, the suffering of their victims, and the lessons humanity must never forget. It is a story not of discovery, but of descent, a reminder of what happens when science serves hatred instead of healing. So close your eyes, settle in, and let this history unfold, not to frighten, but to remember. And before we begin, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there, because across time zones and generations we carry the memory together, so the world never forgets. In the shadow of the Third Reich, medicine, a discipline meant to heal and protect human life, was corrupted and weaponized into a tool of unimaginable cruelty. Under Nazi rule, doctors, scientists, and researchers, many highly trained and respected, turned their skills toward the service of ideology rather than humanity. Concentration camps, already instruments of terror, became laboratories where prisoners were stripped not only of dignity but of their very humanity, reduced to test subjects for grotesque experiments. This chapter introduces the harrowing story of how medical science, when bent to the will of dictatorship, became a weapon of torture rather than a beacon of progress. The scope of these atrocities was vast. Experiments in hypothermia, high-altitude survival, infectious diseases, sterilization, and chemical exposure scarred thousands and killed countless more. Victims, selected because of their ethnicity, political beliefs, or physical vulnerability, were forced into unimaginable suffering under the guise of research. The ideology of racial purity and military supremacy justified the horrors in the eyes of perpetrators who cloaked their actions in scientific language. Yet beneath that veneer, these acts represented the betrayal of medicine's most fundamental oath, to do no harm. This documentary embarks on a journey into that dark intersection of ideology, science, and power. To understand these medical crimes, one must grasp how the Nazi regime systematically twisted the relationship between science and politics. Medicine in Germany had long been a respected profession, admired for its research and clinical advancements. But with the rise of the Nazis, medical science was harnessed to serve the goals of racial hygiene, military dominance, and ideological conformity. Doctors became architects of policies that categorized lives as valuable or expendable, paving the way for sterilizations, euthanasia, and later lethal experimentation. What was once a noble pursuit of discovery and healing transformed into a bureaucratic and militarized system of cruelty. The state rewarded compliance, offering prestige, funding, and career advancement for those who aligned their research with Nazi priorities. By intertwining medicine with ideology, the regime created a culture where experimentation without consent was normalized and even celebrated. The experiments themselves were not random. They were meticulously planned to support battlefield strategies, reinforce racial theories, and satisfy curiosity unchecked by ethics. This perversion of science was not only tolerated but encouraged, making it a central instrument of dictatorship. The concentration camp served as the epicenter of this medical corruption, providing a captive population stripped of rights, voice, and recognition. Dachau, Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and other camps became laboratories of suffering, where prisoners deemed racially inferior or politically undesirable were subjected to experiments that ignored every principle of humanity. Prisoners were immersed in freezing water to study hypothermia, subjected to decompression chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions, infected deliberately with diseases like malaria or typhus, and forced into surgeries without anesthesia. These tests were conducted not in secrecy, but often with official sanction, documented and reported as though they were legitimate scientific studies. The camps provided what the Nazis called ideal conditions, unlimited subjects, no legal oversight, and the possibility to discard lives once they were deemed no longer useful. Victims ranged from children to the elderly, men and women alike, each reduced to data points in the grotesque ledger of Nazi science. The camps became the stage upon which the nightmare of science twisted by ideology played out most visibly. The perversion of medicine under Nazi rule cannot be separated from the broader context of dictatorship. In a society where dissent was crushed, propaganda was pervasive, and ideology was paramount, science became subservient to political dogma. The concept of racial hygiene framed medicine as a tool to purify the population, presenting experiments not as crimes but as necessities for national survival. Military imperatives added another layer, as Germany sought ways to protect its soldiers from the extreme conditions of war, even if it meant sacrificing prisoners in the process. Pharmaceutical companies and research institutes often cooperated, seeing profit and prestige in aligning with the regime's goals. Scientists who objected were sidelined, silenced, or punished, while those who participated were celebrated as pioneers. Under dictatorship, the ethical boundaries that normally govern medicine evaporated, replaced by directives from a political system that valued ideology over human life. The horror was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices made by individuals and institutions complicit in the regime's crimes. The scope of this documentary extends beyond the mere cataloguing of experiments. It seeks to reveal the human suffering behind every test, chart, and statistic. Each procedure, however clinical it appeared in Nazi records, represented the torment of living individuals, subjected to pain, fear, and indignity. Survivors would later describe the unbearable cold of hypothermia experiments, the agony of forced infections, and the trauma of surgeries performed without anesthesia. These testimonies remind us that the history of Nazi medicine is not just about doctors and data, but about victims whose bodies were treated as disposable. The betrayal of trust between healer and patient, the violation of the Hippocratic Oath, and the calculated cruelty of scientific rationalization combined to create a uniquely horrifying chapter in history. This introduction frames the narrative as not only historical but profoundly ethical, compelling us to confront the consequences when science is stripped of compassion and accountability. The story of Nazi medical experiments also challenges us to reflect on the responsibility of knowledge and the fragility of ethical boundaries. Scientific curiosity, unchecked by morality, can lead to discoveries built upon suffering and exploitation. In the Nazi context, the drive for knowledge was coupled with ideological zeal, producing a lethal combination that destroyed countless lives. The experiments, while framed as advancing medicine, often produced flawed or useless results because of their cruelty and lack of scientific rigor. Yet their legacy forced the world to confront the urgent need for ethical standards in research. The Nuremberg Doctors Trial and the creation of the Nuremberg Code would later emerge as direct responses to this history, laying the foundation for modern principles of informed consent and human rights in medicine. This documentary, therefore, is not only a recounting of horrors, but a reminder of the importance of ethics in safeguarding science. As this narrative unfolds, we will journey through the ideological roots of Nazi medicine, the camps that became laboratories, the experiments themselves, the survivors' testimonies, and the post-war reckoning that followed. Each chapter will reveal not only what was done, but how and why it was allowed to happen, connecting the scientific, political, and human dimensions of the story. The intention is not to sensationalize, but to immerse the listener in the reality of these crimes, offering both historical detail and emotional depth. By the end, we will have explored how ordinary doctors and institutions became agents of extraordinary cruelty, how victims endured unimaginable suffering, and how humanity sought to rebuild ethical boundaries after the collapse of the Third Reich. This introduction serves as a gateway into one of the darkest intersections of science and ideology, reminding us that vigilance, memory, and moral courage are essential to prevent repetition. What follows is not only a history lesson, but a warning, an exploration of science corrupted by power, and a tribute to those who suffered in the name of ideology disguised as medicine. Before the rise of the Nazi regime, German medicine enjoyed an international reputation for excellence, innovation, and authority. Universities in Berlin, Munich, and Heidelberg were considered among the best in the world, attracting students and researchers from across Europe and the United States. German doctors were not only healers, but also social figures of immense prestige, trusted voices in public health, policy, and intellectual debate. The medical profession commanded respect akin to priesthood, with physicians often holding sway over both the intimate lives of their patients and the broader cultural ideals of society. In the aftermath of World War I, however, this authority was tested by the collapse of the empire, economic turmoil, and mass suffering caused by famine, disease, and political instability. The influenza pandemic of 1918 had left millions dead, and hospitals were overwhelmed by wounded veterans returning from the war. In this environment of uncertainty, doctors were seen as figures who could restore order, provide answers, and rebuild the health of the nation. Medicine was not just a profession, it was perceived as a pillar of social stability during times of profound dislocation. This social power created the foundation upon which medicine would later be manipulated by ideology. The Weimar Republic, founded in 1919, inherited both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of German medicine. On the one hand, German hospitals, universities, and research institutes continued to produce groundbreaking work in microbiology, surgery, and psychiatry. On the other hand, the economic crises of the early 1920s, including the catastrophic hyperinflation, strained healthcare systems and made access to treatment increasingly difficult for ordinary citizens. Widespread unemployment and poverty created resentment, and doctors often found themselves at the front lines of social struggle, navigating shortages of supplies and desperate patients. Within this turmoil, many physicians began to see their role less as individual caregivers and more as managers of the nation's biological health. Public health campaigns against tuberculosis, venereal disease, and alcoholism expanded, and doctors increasingly used the language of social engineering rather than purely medical treatment. This shift reflected broader anxieties about national decline, demographic weakness, and the desire to restore strength after defeat in war. Medicine in the Weimar period was therefore already primed for a dangerous fusion with ideology, as scientific authority began to overlap with political visions of collective renewal. One of the most influential currents running through German medicine in the 1920s was the rise of eugenics, or what was then often termed racial hygiene. Inspired partly by international movements in the United States and Scandinavia, German eugenicists argued that the health of society depended on managing heredity and controlling reproduction. Doctors and scientists began to frame issues such as disability, mental illness, and poverty not merely as social challenges, but as biological defects threatening the future of the nation. Textbooks, university courses, and public health pamphlets spread the idea that hereditary weakness was a burden to the state and should be eliminated through medical intervention. Sterilization, segregation, and institutionalization were promoted as legitimate tools of preventive medicine, couched in the language of science and efficiency. While some of these ideas predated the Nazis, they gained traction in a Germany struggling with economic collapse, humiliation from Versailles, and fears of decline. Doctors, with their prestige and authority, became powerful advocates for eugenics, shaping public opinion and government policy long before Hitler came to power. The seeds of medical corruption were thus sown in the fertile soil of Weimar anxieties. Eugenics was not confined to fringe theorists but entered mainstream medical practice, supported by respected professors and institutions. Organizations dedicated to racial hygiene published journals, held conferences, and influenced policymakers with the claim that science could strengthen the biological stock of the nation. Politicians from across the spectrum, including liberals and conservatives, found aspects of eugenics appealing, as it promised solutions to social problems through rational scientific management. For doctors, this approach elevated their role from healers of individuals to guardians of the racial future, a responsibility that carried both prestige and power. The language of hereditary health courts and racial fitness began to appear in medical discourse, normalizing ideas that would later be radicalized under Nazi rule. The profession's embrace of eugenics reflected not only scientific enthusiasm, but also deep-seated cultural anxieties about degeneration, overpopulation, and economic burden. By the late 1920s, sterilization of the unfit was openly debated in medical journals, with many doctors viewing it as progressive rather than cruel. The framework for Nazi racial medicine was already being built, brick by brick, under the veneer of scientific respectability. The danger lay not in extremist outliers, but in the mainstream acceptance of pseudo-scientific ideas. The professional prestige of doctors in Weimar Germany made their endorsement of such ideas particularly influential. Patients, often desperate for solutions in the face of economic ruin and social uncertainty, trusted their doctors implicitly. This trust extended into policy, where medical professionals advised governments on welfare, population management, and education. Medical authority was so strong that few questioned the ethical implications of policies justified as improving public health. Eugenics therefore gained legitimacy, not because it was empirically sound, but because it was endorsed by a profession viewed as morally unimpeachable. When respected professors spoke of lives unworthy of life, their words carried the weight of expertise, making radical ideas sound rational and humane. The public saw in these doctors not cruelty, but pragmatism, as science was invoked to solve the pressing problems of poverty and illness. The intertwining of trust, authority, and ideology meant that the groundwork for future abuses was laid not in secret but in public, with doctors acting as both scientists and social engineers. In this sense, the medical profession prepared the cultural climate in which Nazi racial medicine would later thrive. By the early 1930s, the infiltration of ideology into science had become more pronounced, as economic depression and political extremism accelerated the radicalization of German society. Medicine became increasingly politicized, with debates about sterilization, euthanasia, and population policy framed as matters of national survival. Doctors joined professional associations that promoted racial hygiene, while medical journals published articles advocating compulsory sterilization as a scientific necessity. Universities trained new generations of physicians to see heredity and race as central to their professional duties. The language of biology was weaponized, turning medicine into a tool for policing not only bodies but entire populations. At the same time, the collapse of faith in liberal democracy and the rise of authoritarian politics created a society eager for strong, simple solutions to complex problems. Doctors were well positioned to provide these answers, cloaking ideology in the authority of science. By the time Hitler rose to power in 1933, medicine in Germany was already deeply entangled with ideas of racial hygiene, ready to be harnessed by the Nazi state. The transition from theory to atrocity would be swift, because the intellectual and professional groundwork was already in place. The history of medicine in Weimar Germany illustrates how a profession can drift from care to control, from healing to hierarchy, when social crises and ideological pressures converge. What began as public health initiatives and scientific curiosity evolved into policies of exclusion, sterilization, and racial engineering. Doctors, revered for their knowledge and trusted for their authority, became both enablers and architects of this shift, legitimizing pseudoscience with their prestige. The rise of eugenics demonstrated how easily science could be corrupted when ethics were subordinated to ideology. The collapse of the Weimar Republic provided fertile ground for these ideas to flourish unchecked, as desperation and instability encouraged radical solutions. When the Nazis came to power, they inherited a medical establishment already steeped in racial hygiene, eager to expand its influence under authoritarian sponsorship. The perversion of medicine in this period was not an abrupt break, but a gradual descent, facilitated by cultural anxieties, professional ambition, and misplaced trust in science. This chapter underscores the lesson that medicine, stripped of ethics, can become a powerful engine of oppression. The story of Weimar medicine is therefore not only a prelude to Nazi atrocities, but a warning about the fragility of scientific integrity in times of crisis. The roots of Nazi racial hygiene lay not in a vacuum but in a global movement that dressed prejudice in the language of science. At the dawn of the 20th century, eugenics emerged as an influential ideology, claiming that selective breeding and the control of reproduction could improve humanity. In Germany, this movement found particularly fertile ground, merging with cultural anxieties about decline after World War I and the humiliation of Versailles. Eugenics promised to strengthen the nation by eliminating hereditary illnesses, mental disorders, and perceived weaknesses, casting medicine as the tool for biological salvation. Central to this narrative was the idea that society was not merely a community of individuals, but a racial body whose health determined its survival. Doctors, scientists, and politicians embraced these concepts enthusiastically, believing they could engineer a stronger and purer nation. The notion of Aryan superiority, deeply embedded in German nationalist thought, fused with eugenics to create a vision of racial destiny. Within this framework, those who were ill, disabled, or socially marginalized were recast as biological threats rather than people deserving care. The pseudoscience of eugenics transformed prejudice into policy, justifying cruelty as medical necessity. What began as theory soon laid the foundation for systematic sterilization and persecution. The idea of Aryan superiority gave eugenics in Germany a particularly dangerous character. Unlike in other countries where eugenics focused primarily on public health and class, in Germany it was tied to a mythic vision of racial destiny. The Aryan race, portrayed as the bearer of civilization, was said to be threatened by degeneration from within and contamination from without. Nationalists argued that Germany's defeat in World War I and its subsequent crises were evidence of racial decline. The solution, they claimed, was not only political or economic renewal, but biological purification. Texts, lectures, and propaganda materials exalted the Nordic Aryan ideal, while depicting Jews, Roma, and the disabled as burdens or parasites weakening the racial body. Doctors, trained to think of health in terms of populations rather than individuals, reinforced this narrative in medical schools and professional organizations. The Nazi Party later seized upon this ideology, but its intellectual infrastructure was already widespread in German society. The promise of restoring national pride and vitality through racial purification was intoxicating to a country reeling from humiliation and hardship. By the 1920s, the rhetoric of Aryan supremacy had become inseparable from the language of science. Eugenics no longer appeared radical but rational, presented as the natural path to national revival. Forced sterilization became one of the most visible expressions of racial hygiene, presented as a scientific solution to hereditary defects. Even before the Nazis, German doctors debated sterilization as a preventive measure to reduce the number of people deemed unfit to reproduce. With the Nazi rise to power, these ideas were codified into law, beginning with the 1933 Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. This legislation mandated compulsory sterilization for individuals diagnosed with conditions such as schizophrenia, epilepsy, hereditary blindness, deafness, and even chronic alcoholism. Thousands of citizens were brought before so-called hereditary health courts, where panels of doctors and judges decided their reproductive fate. These courts rarely considered personal testimony or consent, treating people as biological specimens rather than human beings. The language of efficiency and health cloaked the cruelty, allowing sterilization to be framed as a public good. Families were torn apart, individuals traumatized, and generations erased by a bureaucratic process masquerading as science. The sterilization program not only violated human dignity, but also legitimized the principle that the state could determine who was worthy of life. It was the first step on a path that would ultimately culminate in mass murder. The ideological justification for sterilization and other eugenic policies rested on the concept of lives unworthy of life. This phrase, introduced in medical and philosophical debates of the early 20th century, argued that certain individuals imposed greater costs on society than the value they contributed. The disabled, the chronically ill, and the mentally impaired were portrayed not as patients deserving care, but as burdens draining national resources. In Nazi rhetoric, they were depicted as dangerous pollutants threatening the racial future. Doctors framed sterilization as a preventive medicine for the body of the nation, much as a surgeon removes diseased tissue to save a patient. Propaganda posters illustrated the financial cost of caring for the disabled, appealing to economic pragmatism as well as racial ideology. By linking public health to racial hygiene, the Nazis blurred the lines between medicine, morality, and politics. This rationalization reassured practitioners that their work was scientific and necessary, not barbaric. Yet beneath this language was the brutal reality of coercion, pain, and erasure of human identity. The ideology of racial hygiene transformed empathy into calculation, redefining compassion as cruelty and care as control. Germany was not alone in embracing eugenics. It was part of a wider global phenomenon that lent legitimacy to its policies. In the United States, sterilization laws had already been implemented in states such as California and Indiana, targeting the mentally ill, the poor, and marginalized communities. Influential American scientists published studies advocating racial improvement, and some German eugenicists cited these examples to argue for similar measures at home. Scandinavian countries, including Sweden, also passed sterilization laws, reinforcing the sense that eugenics was an international scientific consensus. This global influence emboldened German doctors and policymakers, convincing them that their actions were neither radical nor isolated. When the Nazis took power, they merely intensified and expanded practices already accepted elsewhere, giving them a distinctly racial and genocidal dimension. International conferences and publications in the 1920s and 1930s further validated their efforts, as German scientists participated in a global community that often failed to challenge the ethical implications of eugenics. The veneer of international legitimacy shielded Nazi policies from scrutiny in their early stages. What distinguished Germany, however, was the scale, intensity, and ideological fervor with which these practices were pursued. The infiltration of pseudoscience into German medicine created a professional culture where ideology masqueraded as evidence. Academic journals published articles that claimed to measure intelligence, morality, and criminality through heredity, presenting flawed data as objective fact. Universities established institutes for racial biology, training young doctors and scientists to view human diversity through a lens of hierarchy and purity. Textbooks reinforced these ideas, ensuring that medical students internalized the belief that their duty was not only to treat illness, but to shape the racial future. Popular science magazines translated this language into accessible forms, spreading racial hygiene to the general public. In schools, children learn to calculate the cost of supporting disabled individuals, reinforcing the narrative of burden and efficiency. Propaganda films and exhibitions presented eugenics as modern, progressive, and patriotic. The distinction between genuine science and ideology collapsed under the weight of repetition and authority. Doctors were encouraged to see themselves as custodians of the nation's health, rather than as advocates for their patients. By the time Nazi policies escalated, the medical profession had already accepted the premise that biology could be engineered through coercion. This intellectual corruption prepared the ground for atrocities that would shock the world. The roots of racial hygiene thus reveal how medicine, when stripped of ethics, can become an instrument of oppression rather than healing. What began as scientific curiosity and public health reform evolved into policies of exclusion, coercion, and violence. Doctors, armed with authority and prestige, gave these ideas credibility, making racial hygiene seem like progress rather than regression. The Nazi regime merely accelerated and radicalized what was already present, transforming sterilization into euthanasia and eugenics into genocide. The global influence of eugenics provided legitimacy, but in Germany it was fused with a myth of Aryan supremacy and a totalitarian state willing to enforce ideology at any cost. The story of racial hygiene is not merely about Nazi extremism, but about the fragility of science when separated from humanity. It demonstrates how prejudice, cloaked in technical language, can infiltrate institutions and corrupt entire professions. The victims of sterilization, denied the basic right to choose their futures, represent the first casualties of a system that would expand to mass murder. This chapter underscores the importance of vigilance in science, reminding us that knowledge without ethics can pave the road to atrocity. One of the most disturbing aspects of Nazi Germany's history is the sheer number of doctors who willingly joined the Nazi Party and became active participants in its ideology. By 1942, almost half of all German physicians were members of the party, a proportion higher than any other professional group. This staggering statistic raises the question, why did such a respected and educated profession align itself so deeply with a regime built on hatred and violence? The answers lie in a complex mixture of ambition, ideology, and the lure of social prestige. For many young doctors, the Nazi Party offered opportunities unavailable in the overcrowded and competitive medical field of Weimar Germany. Membership promised career advancement, access to research funding, and positions of influence within universities, hospitals, and government institutions. Ideology also played a powerful role, as the rhetoric of racial hygiene aligned seamlessly with the medical profession's growing obsession with population health and eugenics. Doctors did not merely drift into complicity, they actively sought out the regime as a vehicle to expand their authority and fulfill their vision of medicine as an instrument of national strength. This eagerness to participate made them key agents in transforming ideology into policy. The indoctrination of doctors began early, often during their university training, where racial biology and eugenics had become standard parts of the curriculum. Medical students studied heredity not as a neutral science, but as a tool for shaping the racial destiny of the nation. Professors, many of whom were already sympathetic to nationalist or anti-Semitic ideas, reinforced the notion that the physician's duty extended beyond the individual patient to the health of the Volk, or people. Student organizations, such as the National Socialist German Students' League, provided ideological training alongside academic instruction, creating a generation of doctors already steeped in racial thinking. Medical journals and textbooks emphasized the costs of supporting the disabled, portraying them as drains on national resources. By the time these students graduated, they were not only physicians but also convinced racial hygienists, prepared to see their work as part of a larger mission of national renewal. Indoctrination did not stop with education. It continued through professional associations and Nazi organizations that reinforced loyalty and rewarded compliance. The result was a medical community primed to accept and even celebrate the regime's racial policies. Career opportunities under the Nazi regime were a major factor in the medical profession's mass alignment with the party. The new government reorganized healthcare, expanding positions in public health, research, and administration that were filled preferentially by party loyalists. Doctors who embraced the ideology could secure coveted posts in universities, become directors of hospitals, or lead research institutes with generous funding. Those who resisted or expressed skepticism often found themselves sidelined, their careers stunted or destroyed. In this environment, opportunism merged with ideology, creating a powerful incentive to conform. The regime's willingness to invest in racial hygiene projects meant that ambitious doctors had access to resources they could only have dreamed of in the Weimar years. Laboratories, clinics, and research centers became playgrounds for experimentation, shielded from ethical oversight by the protective cloak of Nazi authority. For many, joining the party was less about coerced allegiance and more about seizing the chance to rise in a system that rewarded loyalty with prestige. Medicine became not just a career, but a pathway to influence and power within the Nazi state. Social prestige added another layer to doctors' collaboration, as the regime elevated them to positions of cultural authority. In Nazi propaganda, physicians were depicted as heroic guardians of the racial community, standing on the front lines of the struggle for national survival. Posters, films, and speeches celebrated the role of doctors in purifying and protecting the Aryan race, framing them as scientists and soldiers combined. This public recognition reinforced the profession's sense of mission, making participation in Nazi policies a source of pride rather than shame. Doctors were invited to speak at rallies, lead public health campaigns, and act as experts in racial courts, their authority amplified by the state. Many embraced this visibility, enjoying the social respect and influence that came with being identified as defenders of the nation's future. The aura of prestige masked the reality that their work involved coercion, sterilization, and eventually participation in murder. By cloaking brutality in the language of science and public health, the regime ensured that doctors could present themselves as patriots rather than perpetrators. The profession's social standing became a powerful tool of propaganda, legitimizing Nazi ideology in the eyes of ordinary citizens. Doctors were not passive tools of the regime. They were actively involved in shaping policy. Many became key advisors in drafting laws on sterilization, euthanasia, and racial classification. Hereditary health courts, staffed largely by physicians, decided the reproductive futures of thousands, turning medical expertise into legal judgment. Public health offices, led by doctors, administered sterilization programs and monitored the population for signs of hereditary weakness. In the euthanasia program known as T4, doctors determined who would live and who would be sent to their deaths in gas chambers disguised as medical clinics. These policies were framed as medical decisions, reinforcing the idea that physicians were neutral arbiters of science rather than agents of ideology. In reality, they blurred the line between healing and killing, using the authority of medicine to carry out political violence. Doctors' involvement in policy-making gave Nazi racial ideology a veneer of legitimacy, making it appear grounded in scientific expertise rather than prejudice. This fusion of medical authority and political power was central to the regime's ability to transform radical ideas into systematic practices. Ideological training was formalized through Nazi organizations such as the National Socialist Physicians League, which provided ongoing indoctrination for doctors already in practice. Meetings, publications, and conferences emphasized the physician's role in the racial struggle, reinforcing loyalty to the regime and discouraging dissent. Doctors were required to participate in lectures on racial hygiene, attend training on Nazi health policies, and contribute to propaganda campaigns. The League also acted as a gatekeeper, ensuring that party loyalty became a prerequisite for career advancement. Physicians who resisted were isolated, while those who conformed found themselves integrated into a network of influence and opportunity. The constant reinforcement of ideology created an environment where racial thinking was normalized, making resistance increasingly difficult. Over time, the indoctrination blurred ethical boundaries, convincing many doctors that sterilization, euthanasia, and experimentation were not atrocities but necessary measures. The medical profession was transformed into an ideological army, bound not only by professional standards but by political allegiance. Indoctrination was not an occasional intrusion into medicine, it became part of its very fabric under the Nazi regime. The story of doctors under the Nazis illustrates how a profession built on trust and healing can be corrupted when ambition, ideology, and power converge. Physicians were not coerced en masse. They chose to align with the regime, drawn by opportunity, prestige, and belief in racial destiny. Their active participation in education, policy, and propaganda made them indispensable to the Nazi project, transforming ideology into reality through the authority of science. By embracing indoctrination, they abandoned the Hippocratic Oath and replaced it with loyalty to the state, sacrificing patients to the vision of a racially pure nation. This chapter reveals that the medical crimes of the Nazis were not the work of a few rogue individuals. but the product of a profession deeply embedded in the system. The recruitment and indoctrination of doctors demonstrate how easily science can be weaponized when ethical boundaries are abandoned. It is a sobering reminder that education and expertise are no guarantees of morality, and that even the most respected professions can become engines of cruelty when they serve ideology rather than humanity. When the Nazi regime established its vast network of concentration camps, these sites were not only intended as prisons or instruments of terror, they also became laboratories where ideology was tested on human bodies. Camps like Dachau, Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Buchenwald functioned as arenas of suffering, where doctors and SS officers transformed prisoners into experimental subjects. The transition from incarceration to experimentation was deliberate, rooted in the belief that these individuals had been stripped of humanity and reduced to expendable material for the state. Victims were selected not for their willingness, but for their vulnerability, chosen because they were Jews, Roma, political prisoners, or the disabled groups deemed unworthy of life. Within the barbed wire and watchtowers, medicine was freed from all ethical constraints, shielded by secrecy, and sanctioned by authority. The camps offered what Nazi doctors saw as ideal conditions: a captive population, total control, and no oversight. Orders were issued, records were kept, and experiments were performed under the guise of scientific research, but their true nature was cruelty systematized. These camps were not just instruments of repression, they became the crucible in which science and ideology fused into atrocity. The selection of victims for experiments followed a brutal logic, one that mirrored the broader racial policies of the Nazi state. Prisoners were categorized upon arrival, separated by age, health, and perceived usefulness to the labor system. Those deemed too weak to work were often killed immediately, while others were earmarked for experiments that promised knowledge for military or racial objectives. Children, twins, women, and the disabled were particularly targeted, their bodies seen as offering unique insights for research. Selections were often conducted in cold, clinical fashion, with doctors walking through barracks or lines of new arrivals, pointing silently to indicate who would be subjected to experimentation. Prisoners themselves often had no understanding of what awaited them until they were transported to laboratories or hospital blocks within the camps. Once chosen, they were stripped not only of freedom but of identity, reduced to case numbers in ledgers that recorded their suffering as data. This process dehumanized individuals twice, first by classifying them as racial enemies, and then by redefining them as raw material for medical study. The cruelty of selection was both personal and systemic, embedding atrocity into the very administration of camp life. Secrecy was a defining feature of the camp laboratories, ensuring that experiments could proceed with little outside scrutiny. Although some research was documented in meticulous detail, much was cloaked in euphemisms and coded language that disguised its true nature. Official reports described investigations or studies without acknowledging the violence inflicted on unwilling subjects. The camps themselves were isolated, surrounded by guarded perimeters, and removed from civilian populations, making them perfect sites for hidden experimentation. Within this environment, SS doctors worked in collaboration with medical institutes and pharmaceutical companies, creating a web of complicity that extended far beyond the camp gates. Prisoners were forbidden from speaking of what they endured, and many did not survive to tell their stories. When liberation finally came, survivors' testimonies revealed horrors that had been hidden under layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. The culture of silence served not only to protect perpetrators, but also to normalize their work within the closed world of the camps. To the outside world, these were places of imprisonment. Inside, they were laboratories of human suffering shielded by barbed wire and silence. The involvement of the SS was crucial in transforming camps into laboratories of atrocity. The SS, as the elite enforcement arm of the Nazi regime, oversaw both the security of the camps and the administration of experiments. Doctors working in camps were often SS officers themselves, combining medical authority with ideological loyalty. The chain of command ensured that experiments were authorized at the highest levels, framed as contributions to military or racial objectives. SS guards enforced compliance, dragging prisoners to laboratories, restraining them during procedures, and disposing of bodies when experiments proved fatal. The cold efficiency of this system reflected the SS ethos of discipline and ideological devotion. Experiments were not chaotic acts of cruelty, but carefully organized operations carried out under military supervision. This bureaucratic order gave the appearance of legitimacy, masking barbarity under the structure of officialdom. The SS ensured that doctors operated with impunity, reinforcing the fusion of medicine and state violence. Without the SS, the camps might have remained prisons. With the SS, they became centers of organized medical terror. The administrative structures of the camp laboratories were striking in their complexity, mirroring legitimate research institutions, while perverting their purpose. Dedicated blocks within camps housed laboratories, operating theaters, and storage areas for medical supplies. Records were kept with precision, cataloging procedures, observations, and outcomes as though the suffering of prisoners were scientific data points. Hierarchies within the medical staff mirrored those of universities, with senior doctors overseeing assistants and students, creating the illusion of a teaching environment. Experiments were often linked to larger networks of research, with findings reported to universities, military authorities, or pharmaceutical companies outside the camps. This integration blurred the boundaries between legitimate science and atrocity, making the crimes appear as extensions of professional research. The administrative machinery transformed torture into routine, embedding it within the rhythm of camp operations. Victims were registered, experimented upon, and often executed with the same cold efficiency used to track labor quotas or rations. The structure gave the appearance of order and progress, but at its core was the systematic destruction of human life. The transformation of camps into laboratories also reveals the profound betrayal of medicine's ethical foundations. Doctors who had sworn to heal instead used their skills to harm, often rationalizing their actions as service to science or the nation. The medical blocks of camps resembled hospitals in structure, but were stripped of compassion, functioning instead as theaters of suffering. Patients did not receive treatment to cure them. They were maintained only as long as they were useful for experimentation. Infections were allowed to fester, wounds deliberately inflicted were left untreated, and suffering was prolonged to observe outcomes. This inversion of medical practice turned healing into cruelty and knowledge into violence. For prisoners, the sight of a doctor no longer symbolized hope but terror, as white coats became synonymous with pain and death. The betrayal was not only personal but institutional, as medicine itself was redefined by the regime to serve ideology. The camp laboratories thus became the ultimate expression of science corrupted by power, places where knowledge was pursued without conscience, and life was sacrificed without remorse. The camps as laboratories stand as one of the darkest chapters in the history of medicine, illustrating how structures of power can transform science into a tool of horror. The combination of selection, secrecy, SS involvement, and administrative order created an environment where atrocities were not only possible, but systematic. Victims were stripped of identity and dignity, reduced to material in experiments that blurred the line between research and torture. Doctors operated with the full support of the state, protected by ideology and bureaucracy, ensuring that their crimes were not seen as deviance but as duty. The very spaces of the camps, barracks, laboratories, crematoria, were designed to facilitate this cycle of suffering and concealment. These laboratories remind us that atrocity does not require chaos. It can thrive under order, discipline, and the appearance of legitimacy. The lessons of this history demand vigilance, for they reveal how easily medicine can be corrupted when ethics are abandoned. In these camps, the promise of healing was inverted, and the pursuit of knowledge became indistinguishable from the machinery of death. Among the most infamous of the Nazi medical crimes were the hypothermia experiments conducted at Dachau, where human suffering was weaponized in the name of military science. The Luftwaffe, concerned about pilots shot down over the icy waters of the North Sea, sought data on how long the human body could survive in freezing conditions. Instead of relying on simulations or animal studies, Nazi doctors demanded live human experimentation, and Dachau provided a captive population deemed expendable. Prisoners, often political detainees, clergy, or Jews, were stripped naked and immersed in vats of ice-cold water, while their vital signs were monitored. The victims shivered violently, gasped for air, and eventually lost consciousness as body temperatures plummeted. Doctors stood by with clipboards, recording the stages of agony with detached precision. Many subjects drowned, died from cardiac arrest, or suffered permanent damage even if they survived. These experiments, cloaked in the language of science, represented the calculated fusion of military necessity and medical cruelty. Dachau became a laboratory, not of knowledge but of suffering, where human endurance was tested against the merciless force of cold. The methods employed in the hypothermia experiments were as meticulous as they were monstrous. Prisoners were placed in large tanks filled with ice water or exposed outdoors during winter nights, often restrained to prevent them from escaping their torment. Thermometers were inserted into their bodies to track core temperature drops, and stopwatches measured the progression from violent shivering to eventual unconsciousness. Some were forced to remain submerged until their hearts stopped beating, while others were pulled out at the brink of death to study the process of resuscitation. Blankets, hot baths, and body-to-body warming were tested as rewarming techniques, but these interventions were often cruelly administered, prolonging suffering rather than alleviating it. Subjects were treated as disposable instruments, used repeatedly until their bodies could no longer endure the ordeal. Witnesses later described screams that echoed through the camp, piercing even the hardened indifference of fellow prisoners. For the doctors, however, these cries were data points, stripped of humanity and transformed into numbers in a report. The cold was not just a physical element, it became a weapon wielded by men who redefined cruelty as science. The Luftwaffe's interest in these experiments reflected the desperate priorities of a regime fighting a losing war. German pilots often crashed into freezing waters during aerial battles, and the High Command demanded reliable statistics on survival times and recovery methods. Nazi doctors justified their atrocities by claiming they served a higher purpose, saving the lives of German soldiers. In reality, the data collected was deeply flawed, corrupted by poor methodology, cruelty, and the inherent unreliability of results obtained under duress. The subjects were malnourished, exhausted, and traumatized, conditions vastly different from those of trained military personnel. Any conclusions drawn from their suffering were scientifically unsound, yet the regime valued the illusion of progress over genuine research. Reports were sent to Luftwaffe officials who praised the work as vital contributions to the war effort. The suffering of prisoners was thus reframed as sacrifice for the fatherland, even though it produced little of real medical value. The experiments embodied the collapse of ethical boundaries, where ideology and desperation combined to override both science and humanity. For the victims, The hypothermia experiments were a descent into unimaginable torment. Survivors described the searing pain of cold penetrating their bones, the uncontrollable shivering that racked their bodies, and the slow numbing of limbs as circulation collapsed. As their temperatures fell, hallucinations set in, minds disoriented by the physiological chaos of hypothermia. Some prayed aloud, others screamed until their voices failed, while many fell into a silent stupor before death claimed them. Witnesses recalled the cruel detachment of doctors who timed the agony as though observing mechanical breakdown rather than human suffering. Even the process of attempted resuscitation could be brutal, with scalding baths burning skin or forced intercourse with female prisoners introduced as a grotesque test of body-to-body warming. Few emerged alive, and those who did often carried lifelong scars, frozen tissue, weakened hearts, and psychological wounds that never healed. Each test was a calculated stripping away of dignity, reducing people to mere objects in a cruel equation. For the victims, the cold was not only an environmental condition, but an embodiment of Nazi cruelty, freezing both body and soul. Secrecy surrounded the hypothermia experiments, but within the Nazi apparatus they were celebrated as important research. Reports were circulated among senior Luftwaffe officers, and findings were presented at medical conferences as though they were legitimate contributions to science. Colleagues who attended these presentations often failed to question the methods, either out of fear, complicity, or genuine belief in the necessity of the work. Pharmaceutical companies and military research institutes occasionally collaborated, providing equipment or support in exchange for access to data. The bureaucratic machinery of the Third Reich ensured that the crimes were recorded in detail, making it clear that these atrocities were not the work of a few rogue doctors, but part of a coordinated system. The professional community's silence further legitimized the crimes, embedding them within the broader narrative of war research. The cold calculations of Nazi doctors were thus mirrored by the cold indifference of a society that allowed science to serve ideology unchecked. The experiments were hidden from the outside world but normalized within the regime's internal structures. In this way, Dachau became both a secret and a showcase. The scientific value of the hypothermia experiments was negligible, a fact that underscores the horror of the suffering inflicted. Modern researchers reviewing the Nazi data after the war found it riddled with inconsistencies, methodological flaws, and ethical corruption. Variables were uncontrolled, measurements were unreliable, and the physical condition of the subjects made generalization impossible. The experiments revealed nothing that could not have been studied through ethical means, yet countless lives were sacrificed for results that held little practical application. This disconnect highlights the true nature of the experiments. They were less about discovery than about domination, using science as a pretext for cruelty. The willingness of educated professionals to pursue such flawed research speaks volumes about the corruption of medicine under totalitarianism. Knowledge was not advanced, it was degraded, tainted by the blood of its victims. The failure of the experiments to yield valid insights only deepens the tragedy, as suffering was inflicted without even the hollow consolation of genuine discovery. The cold in the end preserved nothing but a record of human depravity. The hypothermia experiments at Dachau epitomized the perversion of medicine under the Nazi regime, where healing was replaced by harm and curiosity by cruelty. They demonstrate how a profession that prided itself on rationality and compassion could descend into barbarity when ideology dictated its goals. These experiments were not accidents or aberrations. They were deliberate, calculated acts carried out by men who believed themselves to be scientists and patriots. The suffering of their victims echoes across history as a reminder of what happens when science is stripped of ethics and weaponized for power. The cold waters of Dachau swallowed lives, but they also froze into memory the stark lessons of corrupted medicine. In the decades since, these crimes have forced humanity to confront the necessity of ethical safeguards, inspiring the Nuremberg Code and shaping modern standards of research. The experiments stand as both atrocity and warning, proof that knowledge pursued without conscience becomes indistinguishable from torture. In the silent depths of those freezing tanks lies not discovery but despair, a chilling testament to the horrors of science enslaved by ideology. At Dachau, alongside the freezing waters of the hypothermia trials, another set of horrifying experiments unfolded, those designed to simulate extreme altitudes. The Luftwaffe, desperate to understand the limits of pilots flying high-altitude missions without pressurized cabins, sought data on oxygen deprivation and decompression sickness. To answer these questions, Nazi doctors turned once again to the bodies of prisoners who were locked inside specially designed pressure chambers. Within these sealed enclosures, air pressure was rapidly reduced to mimic altitudes of up to 20,000 meters, far beyond the conditions most aircraft could reach. The subjects gasped desperately for air as oxygen levels plummeted, their bodies convulsing in violent seizures as hypoxia took hold. Eyewitness accounts describe prisoners clawing at their throats, their eyes bulging as their lungs struggled against the vacuum-like environment. Many lost consciousness within minutes, while others died outright, their organs ruptured by the rapid decompression. For the doctors conducting these trials, each death was simply another data point, a number to be written down and charted against altitude levels. The chambers became coffins of steel, where science masqueraded as execution. The methodology of the high-altitude experiments revealed the calculated cruelty embedded in their design. Prisoners were strapped into seats inside the chamber, monitored through portholes, while instruments tracked their breathing, pulse, and brain activity. Some were subjected to gradual pressure changes, simulating long climbs, while others endured sudden decompressions meant to mimic aircraft damaged in combat. As the air thinned, many began to hallucinate, slipping into delirium as their brains starved of oxygen. Others experienced agonizing pain as their eardrums burst, their lungs expanded, and their blood vessels ruptured under the strain. Some victims were revived and forced to endure repeated trials, their suffering prolonged to gather comparative data. In certain cases, autopsies were performed immediately after death to examine the effects of hypoxia on organs, meaning subjects were killed deliberately to satisfy scientific curiosity. The brutality was systematic, designed not to test equipment, but to push human endurance to its breaking point. For the doctors, each session was a controlled exercise in torture disguised as research. The chamber, with its dials and gauges, gave the illusion of precision, but in reality it was an instrument of death. The Luftwaffe justified these experiments by claiming they were essential for aviation safety, particularly for pilots forced to eject or survive in unpressurized aircraft. The argument suggested that sacrificing prisoners might save German airmen, thus framing atrocity as patriotism. In reality, the results were both flawed and unnecessary, as ethical avenues for studying oxygen deprivation already existed through voluntary trials and animal studies. What the Luftwaffe received instead were charts filled with the tortured cries of Dachau's prisoners, data corrupted by the weakened physical states of malnourished subjects. Despite this, the reports were distributed among military officials and presented as legitimate contributions to the war effort. The veneer of military necessity cloaked the horror, allowing doctors to continue their work with the assurance of authority. These justifications reveal the intersection of desperation and ideology, where the needs of war provided excuses for brutality. The pilots themselves never knew the full extent of the suffering behind the numbers in their manuals. For the prisoners, the justification meant nothing. The chamber was not about safety, but about dehumanization. War became the excuse, but cruelty was the practice. The experiences of the victims in these experiments were nothing short of nightmarish. Survivors recounted unbearable sensations of suffocation, as if their lungs were collapsing inward, accompanied by blinding headaches and ringing in the ears. Some screamed uncontrollably as their bodies convulsed in seizures, while others fell silent as consciousness slipped away. A few described visions or hallucinations, fleeting images of family or freedom before blackness consumed them. Those who survived were often left physically debilitated, suffering permanent damage to their hearts, lungs, and nervous systems. For many, the psychological trauma was even more profound, as they carried memories of suffocation and helplessness for the rest of their lives. Witnesses from within the camp recalled the eerie silence that often followed a session, broken only by the sound of doors opening to remove lifeless bodies. These experiments stripped away not only health but also dignity, reducing people to unwilling subjects in a theater of controlled agony. The victims' stories stand as enduring testimony to the suffering hidden behind the charts and numbers. Each life extinguished was a reminder that what was framed as science was, in truth, systematic murder. The secrecy of the high-altitude experiments ensured that few outside the Nazi apparatus knew of them while they were being conducted. The chambers were housed in secured sections of Dachau, guarded by SS personnel, who ensured no information leaked beyond camp walls. Reports were sanitized, written in the language of technical research, with no mention of the screams or the deaths that produced the data. To the Nazi hierarchy, these documents suggested progress, reinforcing the illusion that the regime was advancing scientific knowledge. Within the camps, however, the reality was plain. The pressure chamber was a machine of death. Prisoners knew that being selected for the chamber meant likely execution, and many trembled in fear at the mere sight of SS doctors approaching their barracks. After the war, liberated prisoners described these experiments in vivid detail, exposing the horror hidden under layers of official secrecy. What had been presented as confidential military research was revealed as atrocity, shocking even those hardened by knowledge of the regime's crimes. Secrecy had protected the perpetrators, but testimony would strip away the lies. In the courtroom and in history, the chamber became a symbol of science's betrayal. The outcomes of the high-altitude experiments were as futile as they were fatal. Post-war analysis revealed that the data collected was unreliable, riddled with methodological flaws, and compromised by the weakened conditions of the subjects. Healthy, trained pilots could not be compared to starving prisoners already suffering from malnutrition and disease. The experiments revealed little that could not have been discovered through humane studies, yet they left behind a trail of corpses and shattered lives. The Luftwaffe's pursuit of knowledge through cruelty failed to yield meaningful results, demonstrating the hollowness of the justifications given. What was achieved was not progress, but degradation, reducing science to an instrument of ideology and violence. Even the supposed beneficiaries, the pilots, gained nothing of lasting value, while the victims paid the ultimate price. The futility of the experiments highlights their true nature. They were not acts of discovery, but acts of domination. Knowledge was secondary to the demonstration of power, the assertion that prisoners could be used and discarded without consequence. In the end, the chamber preserved no insights, only evidence of moral collapse. The high-altitude experiments at Dachau stand as chilling reminders of the dangers when science is stripped of ethics and humanity. They show how easily the pursuit of knowledge can be twisted into cruelty when ideology dictates its purpose. The pressure chambers, with their dials, levers, and steel walls, symbolized the illusion of rationality masking barbarity. Behind the cold apparatus were victims gasping for air, their lives extinguished in the name of progress that never materialized. These atrocities were not isolated, but part of a larger system where medicine served power rather than compassion. The legacy of these experiments continues to haunt history, reminding us that scientific inquiry must always be bound by conscience and respect for human life. They forced the world after the war to confront the urgent need for ethical safeguards in research, leading directly to principles such as informed consent and human rights in medicine. Yet the lessons came at the cost of countless lives, extinguished in chambers designed not to heal but to harm. The memory of their suffering remains an indictment of science corrupted by ideology. It is a legacy we are bound never to forget. Beyond the freezing waters and suffocating chambers of Dachau, another series of experiments unfolded that turned human bodies into unwilling battlefields for disease. The Nazi regime, facing epidemics among both troops and civilian populations, sought solutions through direct experimentation on prisoners. Malaria and typhus, two of the most feared infectious diseases of the time, became central to this grotesque research agenda. Prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria-carrying mosquitoes or injected with blood drawn from sick individuals, condemning them to fever, chills, and the slow agony of systemic collapse. Typhus, a scourge of armies for centuries, was introduced into the veins of captives to test new vaccines and treatments. The victims were not volunteers, but selected arbitrarily, stripped of choice and dignity, and forced into months of suffering while doctors observed their decline. Every cough, every fever spike, every death was recorded with clinical detachment, as though the agony unfolding was no different from numbers on a chart. For the Nazi doctors, disease was not something to be cured, but something to be inflicted, weaponized against the most vulnerable. In Dachau's hospital blocks, sickness was not a tragedy, but an experiment. The malaria experiments at Dachau were conducted with a methodical cruelty that revealed the cold logic of Nazi science. Hundreds of prisoners were exposed to bites from infected mosquitoes, their bodies turned into living incubators for parasites. Others were injected directly with malaria, bypassing nature's transmission to ensure guaranteed infection. The victims developed fevers that soared uncontrollably, shaking chills that left them convulsing, and weakness so profound they could barely stand. Many were denied treatment until their symptoms reached catastrophic levels, all in the name of observing the disease's natural progression. When therapies were administered, they were often experimental drugs with severe side effects, producing hallucinations, organ damage, or excruciating pain. Some subjects endured cycle after cycle of infection and treatment, their bodies ravaged repeatedly until they could no longer survive. The purpose, according to Nazi doctors, was to discover effective treatments for soldiers stationed in malaria-prone areas, but the reality was suffering disguised as research. Each patient was not a person but a vessel for parasites, studied only until their usefulness expired. For those inside Dachau, malaria was not an accidental epidemic, but a deliberate weapon. Typhus experiments revealed a similarly monstrous disregard for human life. This disease, spread by lice, and characterized by high fever, delirium, and a high fatality rate, had plagued armies for centuries. In the crowded conditions of concentration camps, outbreaks were already common, killing thousands. Instead of treating victims or preventing spread, Nazi doctors intentionally infected prisoners to test vaccines and observe outcomes. Victims were injected with typhus bacteria or exposed to lice carriers, condemning them to weeks of delirium and eventual death. Some were given experimental vaccines developed in partnership with pharmaceutical companies, while others were denied treatment altogether to serve as controls. The suffering was immense. Patients burned with fevers so high that they hallucinated, raved incoherently, and sometimes clawed at their own skin in desperation. The mortality rate was staggering, with corpses piled in infirmary blocks, their deaths recorded with the same detachment as laboratory notes. Typhus became a tool of research rather than an affliction to be cured, its horrors magnified by deliberate design. In these experiments, science was no longer a weapon against disease, it had become a weapon wielded by disease itself. The cooperation of pharmaceutical companies added another layer of complicity to these crimes. Firms such as Bayer and IG Farben supplied drugs and vaccines, eager to test their products in ideal conditions that no ethical laboratory could provide. Concentration camps offered what these corporations considered controlled environments, large populations of subjects carefully monitored, with outcomes measured precisely. Prisoners received experimental compounds that were often toxic, administered in high doses to test their limits. Side effects ranged from violent vomiting and organ damage to rapid death, outcomes that were coldly noted as part of the research process. The companies benefited from data gathered through this suffering, data that was later used to market products as scientifically tested. In exchange, the Nazi doctors received material support, ensuring the continuation of their experiments. This partnership blurred the line between state atrocity and corporate greed, proving that the lure of profit could silence moral objections. In the camps, science and commerce collaborated to transform human agony into a commodity. The pharmaceutical industry's role underscores how deeply Nazi medicine was embedded in broader networks of power and exploitation. For the victims, the infectious disease experiments were prolonged ordeals of suffering, where every day brought new waves of fever, pain, and despair. Prisoners often lay in overcrowded infirmary blocks, writhing on wooden bunks as lice crawled across their skin, spreading the very disease they were meant to endure. The stench of sweat, blood, and vomit filled the air, mingling with the cries of those delirious from fever. Some begged for death to end their torment, while others clung to hope that survival might bring eventual liberation. Families were torn apart when children or parents were selected for infection, their lives extinguished not by chance but by the cold decision of a doctor's order. Survivors recalled the terror of watching fellow prisoners deteriorate, knowing that they themselves were next in line for the same fate. The experiments robbed victims not only of health but of dignity, reducing them to husks of suffering under the watchful eyes of their captors. Even death brought no peace, as bodies were dissected for autopsies to further the research agenda. For those trapped in Dachau and other camps, disease was not an accident, it was imposed. Secrecy and bureaucracy once again cloaked these experiments in a veneer of legitimacy. Reports were compiled and circulated among military officials and research institutes, filled with charts, tables, and medical jargon. The language of science concealed the reality of deliberate infection, reducing human suffering to sterile descriptions of subjects and outcomes. Conferences were held where findings were presented to peers, many of whom applauded the work without questioning its methods. Within this closed circle, atrocities became normalized, hidden under the weight of technical detail and professional recognition. The wider world remained unaware until the camps were liberated and survivors gave testimony. Only then did the horrific reality behind the paperwork become clear, that every statistic represented a life destroyed. The documents that once masked atrocity became evidence in trials, exposing the complicity of doctors and corporations alike. The very precision of the records ensured that the crimes could not be denied, transforming bureaucratic detachment into proof of guilt. The experiments had sought to erase humanity from their victims, but the meticulous documentation preserved their suffering for history. The malaria and typhus experiments epitomize the perversion of medicine under the Nazi regime, where the quest for knowledge became indistinguishable from cruelty. They show how disease, normally an enemy of humanity, was weaponized as a tool of research and domination. Doctors, pharmaceutical companies, and the military all collaborated in transforming concentration camps into sites of orchestrated infection and death. The suffering they inflicted yielded little of scientific value, producing data so corrupted by cruelty and flawed methodology that it was useless. What endured was not knowledge but horror, the legacy of lives extinguished in the name of progress. These experiments remind us that the pursuit of science without ethics leads not to discovery but to destruction. They underscore the responsibility of medicine not only to seek cures but to uphold dignity, compassion, and humanity. In Dachau's fevered wards, the cries of the sick became the soundtrack of corrupted science, a haunting echo that still resonates through history. The story of these experiments is not merely about disease, but about the sickness that spreads when ideology infects medicine. Their memory warns us that the greatest epidemic is cruelty itself. Within the hidden laboratories of Nazi concentration camps, poison and chemical weapon experiments revealed another facet of medicine's corruption under totalitarian rule. The regime, anticipating battlefield scenarios where soldiers might be exposed to gas or chemical burns, demanded research that tested both offensive and defensive measures. Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen became arenas where prisoners were exposed to toxic substances under the guise of military necessity. Victims were forced to swallow poisons or were injected directly with lethal compounds, while others were made to endure chemical burns inflicted on their skin. The goal was to observe how the body responded to toxins and to evaluate antidotes, protective gear, and battlefield treatments. The experiments, however, were conducted without anesthesia, consent, or concern for human suffering, turning human beings into disposable test subjects. In practice, the trials were less about protecting soldiers and more about expanding the capacity for destruction, reflecting the regime's obsession with war at any cost. Each experiment was an act of torture cloaked in the sterile language of science, reducing life to nothing more than a vessel for pain and death. The pursuit of chemical warfare became inseparable from cruelty itself. One of the most notorious sets of trials involved the testing of mustard gas, a chemical weapon already infamous from World War I. Prisoners were deliberately exposed to liquid mustard gas or its vapors, their skin erupting in painful blisters that oozed and cracked. The burns covered entire bodies, leaving victims unable to move without excruciating agony. Some were left untreated to study the natural progression of chemical injury, while others were subjected to crude treatments that often worsened their condition. Doctors meticulously noted how long it took for skin to peel away, for wounds to become infected, and for victims to succumb to sepsis or organ failure. The suffering was prolonged, with patients confined in unsanitary conditions that magnified their agony. For many, death was not quick but slow, an inevitable decline punctuated by days or weeks of unbearable pain. What was presented as an effort to improve protective ointments or clothing was in reality a systematic assault on the human body. These mustard gas trials turned the legacy of World War I's horrors into a tool of renewed barbarity, conducted with cold indifference inside the camps. Poisons were also tested with ruthless precision, administered in ways that guaranteed both suffering and certainty of outcome. Prisoners were forced to ingest toxic substances mixed with food or drink, unaware until the convulsions began. Others were injected with lethal compounds directly into their veins, collapsing within minutes as their bodies betrayed them. Some were given varying doses to test lethal thresholds, a practice that meant their deaths were slow, agonizing descents into paralysis, vomiting, and cardiac failure. Autopsies were performed on the dead and dying, organs removed and studied for the effects of toxins. The results were catalogued as though they were legitimate contributions to pharmacology, while in reality they were records of murder disguised as science. The purpose was not only to identify effective poisons, but also to develop antidotes, yet these antidotes were rarely offered to the victims themselves. For the prisoners, the poison coursing through their veins was not a medical test, but a death sentence carried out under the eyes of men who wore white coats instead of uniforms. In these experiments, the line between healer and executioner vanished entirely. Chemical burns and exposure trials extended beyond mustard gas, as the Nazis tested a range of substances designed for the battlefield. Prisoners were doused with caustic chemicals, their skin left raw, ulcerated, and exposed to infection. Some were subjected to flamethrower fuel burns or incendiary compounds to replicate battlefield injuries, with wounds deliberately left untreated to study progression. Doctors observed how burns spread, how infection set in, and how long it took for organs to fail when skin no longer provided protection. In some cases, amputations followed, not to save lives, but to examine tissue degeneration in controlled stages. Victims screamed and writhed, their bodies consumed by fire and acid, while physicians recorded their agony with detachment. For the perpetrators, these burns were not human tragedies, but data points, proof of resilience or vulnerability measured in hours and days. The battlefield was imported into the camp, where human beings replaced mannequins and simulations. Chemical exposure, once a feared weapon of armies, became a daily reality for prisoners whose bodies were sacrificed to prepare for war. The experiments turned every drop of chemical into an instrument of calculated suffering. The connection between these experiments and battlefield research underscores how ideology corrupted even military necessity. Germany, anticipating chemical warfare as part of future conflicts, sought to weaponize medicine to serve as both shield and sword. Yet the data gathered from the camps was deeply compromised, produced under uncontrolled and inhumane conditions that bore little resemblance to actual combat scenarios. Malnourished, diseased, and traumatized prisoners could not provide valid scientific results, rendering much of the research both cruel and useless. Still, the reports were circulated within military and industrial networks, their findings presented as legitimate. Pharmaceutical companies, again complicit, provided poisons and antidotes, treating the camps as laboratories where regulations and ethics did not exist. Scientists outside the camps reviewed results without openly questioning the morality of their origins. The collaboration between state, industry, and medicine created a seamless system where human suffering was commodified. This was not simply rogue science. It was science institutionalized, aligned with the machinery of war and profit. The battlefield became the justification, but ideology turned the camps into factories of death disguised as research. For the victims, the poison and chemical weapon experiments were agonies without reprieve. Survivors described burns that covered their entire bodies, leaving them unable to sleep, move, or even breathe without pain. Others recalled the sudden onset of poisoning, dizziness, violent vomiting, paralysis, and the terror of knowing that no help would come. Prisoners often begged for death, unable to endure the torment inflicted in the name of science. Families within the camps were torn apart when loved ones disappeared into laboratory blocks, never to return. Corpses were carried out daily, their bodies bearing the scars of burns, the rigidity of convulsions, or the emptiness of organs harvested for study. Witnesses recalled the stench of chemicals lingering in the air, a reminder of suffering that was as inescapable as it was deliberate. These experiments destroyed not only the bodies of their victims, but also the fragile hope that survival in the camps might still be possible. For many, poison and fire became their final companions, their lives extinguished in trials that revealed nothing but cruelty. The victim's agony stands as testimony to the horror of science turned to murder. The poison and chemical weapon experiments reveal the full depth of the Nazi betrayal of medicine, where knowledge was pursued not to heal but to harm. They demonstrate how doctors, scientists, and corporations collaborated to turn human beings into disposable instruments of war. The suffering inflicted produced little scientific advancement, yet it left a legacy of scars, corpses, and testimonies that continue to haunt history. These crimes remind us that science, when divorced from ethics, becomes indistinguishable from violence. They underscore the fragility of professional integrity when ambition, ideology, and profit converge. The victims of these experiments, denied dignity in life, demand remembrance in death, their suffering a warning to future generations. The battlefield may have justified the search for solutions, but it could never justify the means by which they were sought. In the end, the experiments preserved no lasting knowledge, only the evidence of cruelty institutionalized. They stand as proof that medicine without morality ceases to be medicine at all. In their memory, we confront the question of how far humanity can fall when compassion is replaced by calculation. Among the darkest practices carried out in Nazi concentration camps were surgeries performed without anesthesia, procedures that stripped away even the basic pretense of medical care. These operations were not performed to heal, but to harm, designed to study the endurance of the human body under excruciating pain, or to serve ideological and experimental goals. Women, particularly those imprisoned at Ravensbrück, were singled out for these gruesome trials, their bodies mutilated in the name of science. Bones were shattered deliberately, muscle tissue cut away, and grafts attempted without pain relief. As surgeons observed how the body coped with trauma, victims screamed until their voices gave out, their agony echoing through the barracks as fellow prisoners listened in helpless terror. The absence of anesthesia was not due to shortage or necessity. It was deliberate, meant to simulate battlefield conditions and to test the limits of survival. Surgeons with prestigious medical training reduced their patients to objects of study, slicing and stitching without compassion. For the victims, the operating table was not a place of healing, but a stage of unimaginable torment. What should have been medicine's most humane act, surgery to save life, was inverted into an instrument of cruelty. At Ravensbrück, a camp notorious for experiments on women, the so-called rabbits were subjected to mutilations that defy comprehension. Doctors selected young Polish women, often members of the resistance, and subjected them to invasive procedures designed to mimic battlefield injuries. Limbs were cut open, muscles excised, and bones fractured deliberately to study how wounds healed under extreme conditions. Sometimes foreign objects, glass, wood, or bacteria, were introduced into wounds to create artificial infections. The victims endured searing pain as their bodies were turned into experimental canvases, the absence of anesthesia ensuring that every cut, every stitch, every infection was felt in its full intensity. These women were left maimed, unable to walk, their limbs twisted and scarred beyond recognition. Some were executed afterward to conceal the evidence, while others survived only to carry lifelong physical and psychological scars. Their suffering was rationalized as science, yet it was little more than sadism in surgical disguise. The women who endured these operations became living proof of medicine, corrupted by ideology, their pain etched into the memory of history. Ravensbrück's wards were not hospitals, they were torture chambers with scalpels. The removal of bone and muscle tissue was one of the most grotesque features of these experiments. Prisoners were forced onto operating tables where surgeons cut into their limbs to extract sections of bone or muscle, often transplanting them into other bodies in crude grafting attempts. These procedures were intended to explore the possibilities of reconstructive surgery for wounded soldiers, yet the methods ignored every ethical standard and inflicted immense suffering. Victims lay conscious, watching as their bodies were carved apart, the agony so overwhelming that many fainted only to be revived and subjected to further cutting. Infections spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions, and gangrene often set in, leading to amputations or death. Some prisoners were operated on repeatedly, their bodies becoming sites of endless experimentation until they could no longer endure. The wounds, even when stitched, were rarely cared for afterward, leaving women to fester in filth and agony. The supposed pursuit of medical advancement masked what was, in truth, calculated mutilation. The surgical wards of the camps became theaters of horror, where survival was measured not in healing, but in the capacity to endure pain. The endurance testing, carried out through these operations, demonstrated the regime's obsession with pushing human limits at any cost. Victims were deliberately wounded, and then left untreated for days or weeks to see how long the body could resist infection or survive massive trauma. Surgeons tracked the progression of necrosis, observing as tissue blackened, muscles decayed, and bones deteriorated. In some cases, amputations were delayed intentionally, allowing the infection to spread to the bloodstream to observe the process of septic shock. Prisoners screamed for help, begged for mercy, yet their voices were ignored as doctors wrote notes in clinical detachment. The experiments were framed as efforts to improve surgical techniques for the battlefield, but the reality was endurance testing carried out in the most barbaric fashion. Human beings were transformed into experimental animals, their agony weaponized for statistics that were ultimately of little scientific value. Each wound was not only a physical injury, but a calculated assault on dignity, designed to test not only the body's limits, but the soul's capacity for suffering. These trials reduced human beings to tools of endurance in a war against their own survival. The victims of these experiments were overwhelmingly women, whose suffering carried both physical and symbolic weight. Many were members of resistance movements, selected not only for their availability, but as a form of punishment for defying Nazi authority. Their bodies became battlegrounds where ideology, misogyny, and cruelty intersected. The absence of anesthesia turned each operation into a form of torture, a deliberate act of domination that reinforced the powerlessness of the victims. Women who survived often found themselves permanently disabled, unable to walk or care for themselves, condemned to lifelong dependence. Some were executed after the experiments to erase evidence, their broken bodies discarded as though they had never existed. Survivors carried their scars as living testimony, bearing both the physical marks of mutilation and the psychological burden of remembered screams. The suffering of women in these wards was not an accident of war, but a deliberate choice, an extension of a system that saw their bodies as expendable. Their endurance stands as one of the most harrowing examples of human resilience in the face of cruelty masquerading as science. The secrecy surrounding these operations mirrored the broader culture of concealment within the camps. Procedures were recorded in medical files that used technical jargon to disguise the brutality, describing mutilations as studies in healing or investigations of infection. Reports were circulated to military and academic institutions, where many doctors accepted the findings without questioning the methods. Within the camps, survivors often whispered about the screams that echoed from operating rooms, but fear silenced most from speaking openly. The SS protected the perpetrators, ensuring that no outside scrutiny threatened their work. When the camps were liberated, The evidence of these operations shocked even seasoned soldiers, who described the surgical wards as scenes of barbarism beyond imagination. Testimony from survivors at post-war trials confirmed the cruelty in devastating detail, turning medical records into evidence of war crimes. The very documentation meant to legitimize the experiments instead became proof of atrocity. What had been hidden under the guise of science was revealed as mutilation institutionalized. The silence of the wards was broken only when survivors found the courage to tell their stories. The legacy of surgery without anesthesia in Nazi camps reveals the depths of cruelty that can be reached when ideology destroys ethics. These operations were not designed to save lives, but to inflict suffering, to test endurance, and to gratify a perverse vision of science, subordinated to power. They demonstrate how doctors, trained to heal, can become executioners when they abandon compassion and conscience. The victims, particularly the women of Ravensbrück, remind us that history's darkest moments are written not only in grand battles, but in the screams of individuals strapped to tables. Their scars, both physical and emotional, speak across generations, demanding remembrance and vigilance. The experiments yielded no genuine medical advancement, only proof of human depravity when science is corrupted. Yet, in their suffering, the victims left behind a legacy of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit endures. These surgeries without anesthesia stand as monuments of pain, etched into history as warnings of what happens when medicine forgets its oath. They remain one of the most harrowing indictments of science, weaponized by ideology. Within the sprawling hell of Auschwitz, one section stood out for its singular focus on the persecution of the Romani people. The so-called gypsy camp, or Zigeunerlager. Here, thousands of men, women, and children of Romani heritage were crowded into wooden barracks, their lives reduced to numbers in a system obsessed with racial classification. Unlike other groups, the Roma were subjected not only to forced labor and starvation, but to a barrage of so-called scientific studies aimed at proving their inferiority. Anthropologists and doctors descended upon the camp with calipers, scales, and notebooks, measuring skulls, cataloging facial features, and recording skin color. The purpose was not discovery, but confirmation of prejudice, an attempt to enshrine stereotypes in the language of science. For the victims, the indignity of being treated as specimens compounded the daily horrors of hunger and disease. Children were stripped naked and measured, their cries ignored by men who saw them not as human beings, but as data points in racial charts. The gypsy camp became both a prison and a laboratory, where ideology masqueraded as anthropology. Its story reveals the depth of cruelty that emerges when science abandons humanity for dogma. The anthropometric studies carried out in the gypsy camp reflected the Nazis' obsession with classification and hierarchy. Researchers from institutions such as the Racial Hygiene and Population Biology Research Center meticulously recorded body proportions, eye color, and hair texture, convinced that physical traits revealed racial destiny. Prisoners were photographed from every angle, their images catalogued in vast archives meant to demonstrate the supposed primitiveness of the Romani race. Calipers traced the contours of skulls, while charts compared Romani measurements to those of Germans, Jews, and other groups. The goal was to construct a hierarchy of worth, where the Aryan ideal stood at the pinnacle, and the Roma were relegated to the lowest rungs of human existence. This pseudo-science cloaked hatred in the trappings of objectivity, transforming prejudice into policy. Victims endured these humiliations, knowing that the data collected would be used to justify their oppression and eventual extermination. The studies revealed nothing of true scientific value, but they served the Nazis' purpose to legitimize genocide by pretending it was rooted in evidence. In the gypsy camp, anthropology became the language of dehumanization. Sterilization was another tool of racial persecution inflicted upon the Romani people, often carried out under the guise of medical progress. Doctors experimented with crude surgical techniques and chemical injections designed to render individuals infertile without anesthesia or consent. Women were injected with caustic substances that caused agonizing burns and infections, while men were subjected to surgical procedures that left them crippled or dead. These operations were often performed in unsanitary conditions, ensuring that many victims suffered not only sterilization but sepsis, organ failure, or death. For the Nazis, sterilization was framed as a hygienic necessity, a way to prevent the reproduction of what they deemed undesirable populations. For the victims, it was an assault on body, dignity, and identity, erasing the possibility of family and future. Sterilization was not only physical mutilation, it was cultural erasure, an attempt to destroy the Romani lineage by cutting off its continuation. The camp became a site where reproduction itself was weaponized, transforming the intimate act of life into a target of ideological violence. This assault on fertility was as devastating as any weapon of war, leaving scars that reached far beyond the individual to entire generations. The Romani children of Auschwitz were also subjected to racial comparisons that bordered on the grotesque. Researchers like Josef Mengele lined them up, measuring their limbs, comparing their teeth, and photographing their eyes for iris color studies. In some cases, children were forced to participate in twin experiments where one sibling was mutilated or killed to compare anatomical differences. For these young victims, childhood was replaced by a series of humiliations, their innocence consumed by the cold gaze of racial science. Some were placed in cages for observation, treated no differently than laboratory animals. Mothers watched helplessly as their children were paraded before doctors who viewed them not as sons and daughters, but as specimens in a grand racial study. The cruelty was magnified by the knowledge that these experiments were designed not to save lives, but to justify extermination. For the children, the camp was not only a place of hunger and fear, but of relentless intrusion into their very being. Their bodies became battlegrounds where ideology sought to prove inferiority, and their suffering became entries in ledgers of pseudoscience. Childhood itself was dissected and destroyed in the gypsy camp. The eventual extermination of the Romani population in Auschwitz underscored the true purpose of these so-called studies. After months of measurement, sterilization, and experimentation, the Nazis concluded not that the Roma were inferior, but that they were unnecessary. In August 1944, thousands of men, women, and children from the gypsy camp were marched to the gas chambers in a single night, their screams swallowed by the machinery of mass murder. The data collected from their bodies was archived, but the people themselves were erased, reduced to ashes in the crematoria. The extermination revealed the ultimate trajectory of racial anthropology in the Nazi system. It began with calipers and photographs, and ended with Zyklon B. For the doctors and anthropologists involved, the extermination was not a contradiction, but a conclusion, the logical endpoint of studies designed to dehumanize. The gypsy camp thus became both laboratory and graveyard, where science was twisted into a prelude to genocide. The extermination of the Roma is often overshadowed in historical memory, yet it remains one of the most haunting examples of how pseudoscience can lead directly to annihilation. Survivors of the gypsy camp carried memories that defied the Nazis' attempts at erasure. They recalled the humiliation of being photographed and measured, the agony of sterilization, and the terror of watching loved ones disappear into the gas chambers. Their testimonies revealed the dual nature of the persecution. It was both physical and psychological, a destruction of body and spirit. Survivors spoke of the indignity of being treated as specimens, stripped not only of rights but of humanity itself. Many carried lifelong injuries, unable to bear children or walk without pain, reminders etched into flesh of the cruelty they endured. Their voices, recorded after the war, gave names and faces to the numbers in Nazi archives, reclaiming dignity from the dehumanization. These testimonies forced the world to confront not only the crime of extermination, but the crime of science corrupted. The survivors' resilience stands as a rebuke to those who sought to erase them, a testament to endurance in the face of calculated annihilation. Their stories keep alive the memory of a people nearly destroyed by the false certainties of racial anthropology. The Gypsy Camp and its associated racial anthropology experiments illustrate the ultimate betrayal of science and medicine under the Nazi regime. What should have been tools of discovery and care were twisted into instruments of oppression and extermination. The calipers and cameras wielded by anthropologists did not measure truth but manufactured lies, reinforcing a worldview that justified genocide. Sterilization, mutilation, and extermination were framed as medical or scientific necessities, erasing the boundary between research and atrocity. The Romani people, already marginalized in European society, were transformed into prime targets for this fusion of prejudice and pseudo-science. Their suffering exposes the dangers of allowing ideology to define science, of permitting prejudice to masquerade as fact. The Gypsy Camp stands as both a symbol of loss and a warning, reminding us that when humanity is stripped away, science can become a weapon of destruction. Its legacy challenges us to remember the victims not as specimens, but as people whose lives were stolen in the pursuit of lies. In their memory, we are reminded that truth without compassion is as deadly as any weapon. In the vast machinery of Nazi medical experimentation, women endured some of the most intimate and invasive cruelties ever inflicted under the guise of science. Their bodies became sites of sterilization experiments, reproductive manipulation, and forced pregnancies, all conducted without anesthesia, consent, or dignity. In camps such as Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Birkenau, doctors treated female prisoners as raw material for exploring ideological fantasies of racial control. Women were injected with caustic chemicals into their wombs, subjected to surgical sterilization, or forced to endure experimental contraceptive procedures that caused lasting injury. Others were coerced into pregnancies either to test methods of termination or to supply children for racial studies and adoption programs. For these women, survival was bound not only to hunger and disease, but to the relentless intrusion of their captors into the most personal aspects of their existence. Their suffering was magnified by the deliberate targeting of fertility, a cruelty that robbed them not only of health, but of the very possibility of motherhood. The camps became laboratories where reproduction itself was weaponized, turning women's bodies into contested battlegrounds of ideology and control. Sterilization experiments represented one of the most systematic assaults on women's bodies. Doctors injected substances such as iodine, silver nitrate, and caustic solutions into uteruses, causing searing pain, burns, and infections. Radiation beams were directed at reproductive organs, leaving women sterile while also damaging surrounding tissues, kidneys, and intestines. These procedures often led to hemorrhages, chronic pain, and death, yet they were justified as efficient methods of preventing undesirable populations from reproducing. Women writhed in agony during these experiments, screaming as their bodies were mutilated from the inside out. The aim was not simply medical but ideological, to ensure that entire groups, Jews, Roma, and other targeted communities, could no longer bring forth future generations. Survivors of these sterilizations often carried lifelong injuries, Unable to bear children or even walk without pain, their futures stolen in moments of clinical brutality. Sterilization became a form of genocide by surgical means, cloaked in the language of racial hygiene. For the women who endured it, the cruelty was not abstract, but carved into their very bodies, a constant reminder of ideology's violence. Reproductive manipulation extended beyond sterilization into experiments that sought to control or alter pregnancy itself. Some women were subjected to forced inseminations, while others were coerced into carrying pregnancies for the purposes of racial studies. In certain camps, women were impregnated deliberately, only to have their pregnancies terminated through crude and violent procedures. Doctors performed experimental abortions without anesthesia, cutting into women's wombs with instruments that caused sepsis, hemorrhage, and death. Others were forced to carry pregnancies to term, with newborns often taken away immediately, either killed, used in further experiments, or sent to be raised in Nazi-approved families. The women who endured this cycle suffered not only physically but emotionally, watching helplessly as their children were torn from them. These manipulations reflected the Nazi obsession with controlling life at its very source, turning reproduction into another battlefield for ideology. For the victims, every aspect of motherhood was stolen: the ability to conceive, the right to carry, and the hope of nurturing life. What should have been sacred became a site of profound violation, leaving women broken in body and spirit. The psychological suffering inflicted upon women in these experiments was as profound as the physical torment. Beyond the pain of surgical procedures and forced pregnancies was the constant fear of being selected for experimentation, a terror that haunted every day of camp life. Women whispered in barracks about the screams from operating rooms, each sound a reminder of their possible fate. Survivors described the humiliation of being stripped, examined, and violated, under the cold gaze of doctors who saw them not as people, but as specimens. The destruction of reproductive capacity was particularly cruel, striking at the core of identity and hope for many women who had dreamed of families. Mothers watched in despair as their children were taken, while others carried the unbearable knowledge that they had been sterilized, their futures erased. The psychological scars endured long after liberation, as survivors grappled with grief, shame, and the haunting memory of what had been stolen from them. These experiments destroyed not only health, but trust in the sanctity of one's own body. The wounds cut deeply into both flesh and soul, lingering as echoes of trauma across lifetimes. The suffering of women in Nazi camps was magnified by the intersection of gender and ideology. While men endured brutal experiments as well, women were targeted specifically for their reproductive capacity, their role in perpetuating life exploited as a means of racial control. This targeting was not incidental. It was a deliberate strategy aimed at erasing populations through the womb. The cruelty extended to girls as young as teenagers, whose bodies were mutilated before they had even reached maturity. Women became symbols of both vulnerability and resistance, their suffering representing the destruction of generations yet unborn. Their treatment revealed the Nazi obsession with controlling not only life but lineage, erasing entire futures by attacking fertility. This focus on reproduction transformed women into unwilling symbols of a racial war, their bodies turned into battlegrounds where ideology was enforced with scalpels, chemicals, and forceps. The experiments highlight how deeply misogyny and racism intersected in the Nazi worldview. Women's unique role in sustaining life became the very reason their bodies were targeted for destruction. Secrecy and bureaucracy once again cloaked these atrocities in the false language of medical research. Reports described sterilizations and reproductive experiments as efficiency studies or population hygiene, erasing the screams of women with sterile terminology. Pharmaceutical companies and research institutes quietly supported the trials, interested in data that could not be ethically obtained elsewhere. Within the camps, women disappeared into medical blocks, their absence explained away by records that reduced them to numbers and outcomes. Survivors later recounted the terror of seeing fellow prisoners return broken and bleeding, or not return at all. For the perpetrators, the language of science and policy provided a shield against moral reckoning, yet when the camps were liberated, the survivors' testimonies tore through the veil of bureaucracy, revealing the cruelty behind the jargon. What had been framed as research was exposed as systematic mutilation and violation. The contrast between the sterile language of reports and the lived agony of victims underscores the depth of the betrayal. In these documents, science's authority was misused to mask horror, a deception that history refuses to forget. The legacy of women as subjects in Nazi medical experiments is one of profound suffering, resilience, and remembrance. These experiments did not advance science or medicine. They advanced only cruelty, leaving women scarred, broken, and bereft of futures. Yet their stories endure, told by survivors who refuse to let their suffering be erased. The scars borne by these women remind us that ideology, when unchecked, can reach into the most intimate corners of human existence. Their endurance in the face of unimaginable violation stands as a testament to resilience, even as it highlights the depths of atrocity that medicine can descend to when ethics are abandoned. The memory of these women demands vigilance, ensuring that never again will science be allowed to serve ideology at the expense of humanity. Their pain must be remembered not as data points, but as human experiences, etched in history as both warning and tribute. The experiments on women's bodies expose the fragility of medical morality, a fragility that must never again be exploited. In remembering them, we confront the true cost of science enslaved by hate. Behind the barbed wire of Nazi concentration camps, the collaboration between medicine and industry revealed one of the most disturbing realities of the era: corporate complicity in atrocity. Pharmaceutical giants such as Bayer, IG Farben, and others did not merely supply the regime with drugs and chemicals, they actively participated in experiments that turned prisoners into test subjects. These companies saw in the camps a laboratory without ethical constraints, where trials could be conducted on a massive scale with no concern for consent or safety. Prisoners were injected with experimental compounds, forced to ingest toxic drugs, and subjected to treatments whose only guarantee was suffering. Each outcome, whether survival, debilitation, or death, was meticulously recorded as research data. For corporations, the results represented potential profit and prestige, while for the victims they meant agony and destruction. The collaboration blurred the line between state violence and private enterprise, revealing how greed and ideology can converge in acts of mass cruelty. Industry was not a passive bystander, but an active partner, embedding itself into the machinery of death that defined the Nazi medical system. IG Farben, one of the largest chemical conglomerates in the world at the time, played a central role in this partnership. Known for its involvement in producing synthetic rubber, fuel, and chemicals essential for the German war effort, the company also provided Zyklon B, the gas used in extermination chambers. But its crimes extended beyond supply chains. IG Farben operated factories adjacent to camps such as Auschwitz, where prisoners were forced into slave labor under inhumane conditions. Within these facilities, individuals were worked to exhaustion, often dying from starvation, disease, or sheer brutality. At the same time, IG Farben scientists exploited camp populations as experimental subjects, testing new drugs and treatments with no regard for survival. The company's executives visited these sites, fully aware of the suffering that underpinned their profits. They rationalized their involvement as contributions to national defense, masking greed and complicity with patriotic rhetoric. For the prisoners, IG Farben represented not only forced labor but the extension of their captivity into the realm of corporate exploitation. The corporation's laboratories became extensions of the camp itself, where profit was built upon agony. Bayer, a subsidiary of IG Farben, became infamous for its direct involvement in drug experiments conducted on prisoners. Bayer scientists obtained groups of inmates from Auschwitz, treating them as commodities purchased for testing. Prisoners were injected with experimental pharmaceuticals designed to treat typhus, tuberculosis, or other wartime diseases, with outcomes carefully observed. Many suffered violent reactions, vomiting, organ failure, blindness, and death. Survivors recalled the chilling casualness with which doctors administered injections, recording results while ignoring the screams of their subjects. In some cases, prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases and then given Bayer compounds, creating double layers of torment. For the company, these experiments provided data that could not be ethically obtained elsewhere, and executives saw the results as opportunities to expand markets. The victims, however, saw only pain, as their bodies became battlegrounds for corporate ambition. Bayer's role in these experiments reveals the deep entanglement of private industry with the regime's atrocities, showing how profit motives can strip away even the most basic human decency. The company's logo became, for many, a symbol not of medicine but of suffering. The profit motives of these corporations were thinly disguised under the language of scientific progress and wartime necessity. Executives presented their work as patriotic contributions to the survival of the Reich, while internally they viewed the camps as opportunities to cut costs and accelerate research. Prisoners required no salaries, no protections, and no consent, making them the cheapest possible resource for large-scale trials. Pharmaceutical companies used this captive population to bypass ethical obstacles, creating data that would otherwise have taken years of voluntary testing. Contracts were drawn up, budgets allocated, and profits projected, as though the suffering of thousands were simply another business expense. This corporate mindset reveals the extent to which ideology and greed converged, creating a system where life was devalued in pursuit of market advantage. The laboratories of IG Farben and Bayer became indistinguishable from the barracks and crematoria, their balance sheets written in the blood of their subjects. Profit was measured not only in currency, but in the endurance of human agony, commodified by the cold calculations of industry. Prisoners subjected to these experiments endured agonies that defy imagination. They were often uninformed, told nothing of what was being injected or ingested, their bodies reacting violently to unknown substances. Fever, convulsions, blindness, and internal bleeding became common fates, while death came as both release and evidence for corporate reports. Survivors described being lined up for injections, their veins pierced by needles delivering compounds that burned, paralyzed, or poisoned. Those who collapsed were dragged away, their suffering documented by men in white coats who showed no hint of compassion. For the victims, the betrayal was profound, as the very symbol of medicine, the doctor's presence, had been transformed into an instrument of death. Their bodies bore not only the scars of physical torment, but the weight of knowing they had been reduced to commodities in a business transaction. Even in the barracks, prisoners spoke of Bayer experiments or IG Farben injections with dread, associating corporate names with inevitable suffering. For them, science had become indistinguishable from cruelty, and industry was another captor as merciless as the SS. The bureaucratic structures of these collaborations reveal how atrocity was normalized. Reports were filed to corporate headquarters documenting outcomes as though they were ordinary research projects. Charts, statistics, and summaries were circulated, filled with technical jargon that concealed the reality of torture. Within these documents, the deaths of prisoners appeared as failures or adverse outcomes, stripped of humanity and reduced to data points. Conferences were held where results were shared among scientists and executives, many of whom applauded the progress without questioning its origins. The system functioned with chilling efficiency, transforming mass suffering into corporate knowledge. When the war ended, many of these records were used as evidence in trials, exposing the complicity of industry in crimes against humanity. Yet at the time, the paperwork created a veneer of legitimacy, allowing executives to claim they were pursuing progress rather than profiting from pain. The administrative smoothness of this process highlights the most disturbing truth that atrocity was not chaotic but systematic, embedded in corporate structures designed for efficiency. In the world of Nazi medicine, bureaucracy became a shield for horror. The complicity of pharmaceutical companies in Nazi medical experiments remains one of history's starkest reminders of how greed can corrupt science and medicine. IG Farben, Bayer, and others were not coerced into participation. They chose to collaborate, motivated by profit, ambition, and ideological alignment. Their laboratories became extensions of the camps, their balance sheets soaked in the suffering of countless victims. The experiments yielded little genuine scientific advancement, their data corrupted by cruelty and flawed methodology. Yet the legacy they left behind is immense, forcing the world to confront the dangers of unregulated corporate power entwined with authoritarian ideology. These crimes underscore that industry, like medicine, bears a responsibility not only to shareholders, but to humanity. The survivors of these experiments remind us that behind every corporate decision lay a human life, stripped of dignity in pursuit of profit. The complicity of these corporations ensures that their names remain forever linked with atrocity, their histories a warning against the dangers of unchecked ambition. In remembering this chapter, we acknowledge that the pursuit of profit without ethics leads not to progress, but to devastation. The legacy of Nazi medical experiments extends beyond their cruelty. It reaches into the very heart of science itself, challenging us to confront the line between knowledge and pseudoscience. While the perpetrators claimed they were conducting vital research, their methods and conclusions were scientifically invalid from the very start. Experiments were performed on malnourished, diseased, and traumatized prisoners, conditions that made their results impossible to generalize. Controls were absent, variables ignored, and protocols corrupted by brutality rather than precision. Doctors falsified outcomes to satisfy ideological expectations, producing charts and tables that gave the appearance of rigor while concealing chaos. The experiments were not guided by curiosity, but by prejudice, designed to confirm what Nazi ideology had already decided. For the victims, this meant suffering that produced no genuine knowledge, only the illusion of science. When examined after the war, the data collapsed under scrutiny, revealing not discovery but deception. What the Nazis called research was, in truth, torture masquerading as science, leaving behind a body of work that was as worthless as it was horrifying. The ethical corruption of these experiments was absolute, stripping away the very principles that make science legitimate. In medicine, informed consent, safety, and the pursuit of healing form the foundation of research. Yet in Nazi laboratories, these principles were inverted. Subjects were prisoners who had no choice, no protection, and no hope of benefiting from the knowledge supposedly gained. Pain was not a side effect, but the intended instrument of study, prolonging suffering to observe its effects. This perversion of ethics rendered any results obtained meaningless, for data produced through cruelty cannot stand as genuine science. Moreover, the destruction of trust between doctor and patient reverberated far beyond the camps, staining the very idea of medical authority. Nazi experiments exposed how easily scientific ambition, when divorced from morality, degenerates into pseudoscience. They serve as a reminder that science is not defined solely by instruments and protocols, but by the ethical framework within which it operates. Without compassion, knowledge becomes indistinguishable from violence. The Nazis abandoned this truth, and in doing so, they stripped their work of both morality and meaning. Many results of Nazi experiments were outright falsified, reflecting the pressure on doctors to prove ideological assumptions rather than discover truth. Reports on racial studies, for instance, twisted data to prove Aryan superiority and the supposed inferiority of Jews and Roma. Anthropometric measurements were manipulated, photographs staged, and conclusions drawn before evidence was even gathered. In medical trials, outcomes that contradicted expectations were often discarded, while results that aligned with ideology were exaggerated. Doctors presented their findings at conferences and in reports, cloaked in the technical language of science, while knowing their work could not withstand genuine scrutiny. These falsifications reveal the core of Nazi pseudoscience. It was never about exploration but about justification. The camps provided a stage where data could be manufactured to legitimize genocide, giving atrocities the thin veneer of scientific inevitability. For the victims, this meant their suffering was not even in service of discovery but of lies, their agony twisted into propaganda. The falsified nature of the research underscores how deeply ideology corrupted not only ethics but also the very integrity of scientific method. After the war, the scientific community was forced to grapple with the question of whether any of the Nazi data had value, a debate that exposed the moral dilemmas left behind by atrocity. Some argued that the data on hypothermia or aviation might offer insights, while others countered that flawed methodology and ethical corruption rendered the results useless. Investigations revealed that the conditions under which the experiments were conducted made replication impossible, and the data was riddled with inconsistencies. Moreover, using the results risked legitimizing the crimes, as though the suffering of the victims could be redeemed by practical application. The consensus that emerged was clear: the data was not only scientifically invalid, but morally toxic. To cite it was to risk giving posthumous legitimacy to torture. This debate shaped the post-war development of research ethics, reminding the world that knowledge gained through cruelty cannot be separated from its origins. The supposed utility of the data could never outweigh the atrocity that produced it. In rejecting Nazi science, humanity affirmed that morality and knowledge are inseparable. Despite this rejection, traces of Nazi data occasionally resurfaced in post-war decades, revealing the dangerous temptation to exploit even tainted knowledge. Some researchers, particularly in aviation medicine and hypothermia studies, referenced Nazi experiments in attempts to fill gaps in understanding, yet each time ethical debates erupted, highlighting the impossibility of divorcing the data from its bloody origins. Critics emphasized that using such data betrayed the victims, reducing their suffering once more to a tool for others' benefit. Moreover, the flawed methodologies ensured that even practical applications were limited, making reliance on Nazi results not only unethical but scientifically unsound. This recurring dilemma underscored the enduring shadow cast by the experiments, as medicine and science struggled to reconcile progress with the memory of atrocity. The temptation to use data gathered through cruelty remains a warning, reminding us that science must be guided not only by curiosity, but by conscience. Knowledge without morality is not knowledge at all. It is exploitation dressed in the language of discovery. The post-war misuse of Nazi data exposes the lingering dangers of forgetting this truth. The Nazi experiments highlight the broader problem of pseudoscience masquerading as truth when ideology dictates research. By prioritizing racial theories and military needs over objectivity, the regime transformed science into propaganda. The results of their so-called studies were predetermined, designed to validate beliefs rather than challenge them. This approach not only invalidated their findings, but corrupted the very spirit of inquiry that defines genuine science. The victims of these experiments were not participants in research, but pawns in a spectacle of confirmation bias. Their suffering produced no genuine advancement, but reinforced the illusion of Nazi superiority. This lesson resonates today, warning against the dangers of allowing politics, ideology, or profit to shape research agendas unchecked. True science thrives on skepticism, transparency, and ethics, qualities absent in the Nazi system. Their pseudoscience serves as a reminder that data can be manipulated, truth can be distorted, and cruelty can be disguised as progress when society abandons its safeguards. The collapse of Nazi science is therefore not only a historical indictment, but a timeless warning about the fragility of truth. In the end, the Nazi experiments stand as a monument not to discovery, but to deception, cruelty, and the collapse of scientific integrity. Their data, corrupted by flawed methods and ethical voids, serves no purpose but as evidence of atrocity. What the perpetrators called research was nothing more than pseudoscience wrapped in the trappings of authority, designed to justify genocide and prolong suffering. The victims endured unspeakable torment, yet their agony produced no real knowledge, only reminders of how far humanity can fall when ethics are abandoned. The rejection of this data after the war affirmed an essential truth. Science is not measured only in results, but in the humanity with which it is pursued. The lessons of these experiments echo in modern codes of research ethics, ensuring that never again will progress be pursued at the expense of dignity and life. Their legacy is not knowledge, but warning, etched into history by the blood of those who suffered in its name. Nazi science was no science at all. It was a mirror reflecting the dangers of cruelty disguised as curiosity. Its memory endures as a call to vigilance, compassion, and truth. The true weight of Nazi medical experiments is revealed not in the sterile reports of doctors or the technical jargon of research papers, but in the voices of those who endured them. Survivors' testimonies pierce through the abstraction of numbers, returning humanity to the suffering that bureaucracy tried to erase. In diaries smuggled from barracks, in interviews conducted decades later, and in testimonies delivered during trials, survivors recounted their experiences with clarity and anguish. They described the chill of surgical tables, the sting of needles filled with poisons, the searing pain of infections deliberately induced. Their words bring us face to face with the lived reality of being reduced to a specimen, of being treated as an expendable subject in a monstrous laboratory. Many spoke of the terror that consumed them daily, the dread of selection, the fear of footsteps approaching, the knowledge that survival might mean further suffering. Their testimonies remind us that behind every experiment was a beating heart, a voice, a life that resisted dehumanization. These stories anchor history in the human, ensuring that the victims are not remembered as data points, but as individuals who suffered and endured. Diaries and clandestine writings provide some of the most haunting glimpses into the reality of the camps. Prisoners who managed to record their thoughts often did so at great personal risk, hiding scraps of paper beneath floorboards or in hollowed-out books. In these fragile records, we find descriptions of medical blocks where screams echoed day and night, where friends disappeared and never returned. Women at Ravensbrück wrote of being taken to operating rooms, their bodies mutilated without anesthesia, and of the humiliation of being treated as less than human. Men at Dachau described being submerged in freezing water, fighting for breath while doctors stood by with stopwatches. These writings are raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal, capturing emotions that official documents could never convey. Fear, despair, fleeting hope, and determination all pour from the pages, preserving experiences that the Nazis sought to silence. Each diary stands as an act of resistance, a refusal to allow suffering to vanish unrecorded. Through these words, survivors ensured that their voices would echo beyond the walls of the camps, a testament to endurance in the face of unimaginable cruelty. In post-war interviews, survivors revealed the long shadows cast by the experiments on their lives. Many described chronic pain, infertility, and psychological trauma that persisted decades after liberation. Women sterilized in the camp spoke of grief for children they could never have, their futures stolen by procedures disguised as research. Men who survived poison or infection trials described bodies permanently weakened, plagued by ailments rooted in the experiments of their youth. Beyond physical suffering was the emotional burden, nightmares, flashbacks, and the weight of remembering horrors that few could comprehend. Survivors often spoke of feeling compelled to bear witness, to ensure that their suffering was not forgotten, even when recounting it reopened old wounds. Their interviews reveal not only the cruelty of the camps, but the resilience of those who lived to speak. In their voices we hear both the pain of survival and the determination to transform trauma into testimony. These accounts bridge the past and the present, allowing new generations to confront history through the eyes of those who endured it firsthand. Courtroom testimonies provided some of the most detailed and devastating accounts of Nazi medical experiments. At the Nuremberg Doctors Trial, survivors stood before judges and described the atrocities inflicted upon them. Often in harrowing detail, they spoke of being strapped to tables, injected with unknown substances, and left to writhe in pain while doctors recorded their suffering. Women recounted sterilizations and mutilations, while men described drowning sensations during hypothermia experiments or suffocation in pressure chambers. The courage required to speak of these traumas publicly was immense, yet survivors persisted, determined to expose the perpetrators and demand justice. Their words shocked the world, stripping away any remaining illusions about the nature of Nazi science. Testimonies became evidence, transforming personal suffering into historical record and judicial condemnation. For survivors, these moments were both cathartic and painful, a chance to speak the truth, but also to relive horrors they had struggled to bury. In court, their voices stood against the silence of the dead, ensuring that the crimes of medicine corrupted would never be denied. Their bravery gave the world the clearest picture of what had happened behind camp walls. Survivors' testimonies also reveal the bonds of solidarity and the moments of humanity that persisted even in the darkest conditions. Many recalled how fellow prisoners tried to comfort them after experiments, sharing scraps of food or whispered words of encouragement. Women who endured mutilations together became lifelong sisters, their shared suffering forging unbreakable bonds. Some spoke of clandestine acts of defiance, such as smuggling notes about experiments to the outside world or refusing to cooperate with doctors. Others remembered how nurses or prisoners, forced into assisting in experiments, sometimes risked their lives to offer small mercies, an extra bandage, a moment of compassion, a warning of what was to come. These glimpses of humanity stand as counterpoints to the cruelty of the experiments, reminding us that even in a system designed to erase dignity, solidarity survived. Testimonies reveal that while Nazi medicine sought to destroy the human spirit, it could never fully succeed. Survivors' memories preserve not only the agony of the camps, but also the resilience of those who endured them together. Their voices carry the echoes of both pain and defiance. The emotional weight of survivors' testimonies lies not only in their descriptions of suffering, but in the silences that follow. Many struggled to find words adequate to describe what they endured, pausing as tears overcame them, or as memories became too painful to articulate. Some survivors admitted that their greatest fear was not death, but being forgotten, that their pain would vanish into the anonymity of history. In speaking, they reclaimed their humanity, transforming themselves from silent victims into active witnesses. Their testimonies forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths, that doctors had become torturers, that science had become murder, and that society had allowed it to happen. These voices challenged denial and silence, reminding future generations that remembrance is a responsibility, not a choice. In their pauses and their tears, we hear the echoes of suffering too immense for words. Yet in their very act of speaking, survivors ensured that silence could never fully erase their experiences. Their voices became monuments of memory, standing where stone and steel could never reach. In the end, survivors' testimonies formed the most powerful indictment of Nazi medical crimes, more damning than any chart or document. Their words give names, faces, and emotions to what perpetrators tried to reduce to statistics. Through diaries, interviews, and courtroom accounts, they transformed their suffering into history, ensuring that future generations would know not only what was done, but what it felt like to endure it. Their stories illuminate the human cost of ideology unchecked, science corrupted, and medicine perverted. They remind us that behind every experiment was not just a subject, but a person with dreams, families, and futures stolen. Survivors carried their pain into the post-war world, but they also carried resilience, using their voices to demand remembrance and justice. Their testimonies remain essential, not only as records of atrocity, but as warnings about the fragility of ethics in times of power and ambition. In their words, the victims live on, their suffering etched permanently into our collective conscience. These voices, fragile yet unbreakable, ensure that the horrors of Nazi medicine are never forgotten, never denied, and never repeated. When Allied soldiers first pushed open the gates of concentration camps in 1945, they did not simply stumble upon prisons. They uncovered laboratories of horror where medicine had been twisted into cruelty. Troops who entered Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, and Ravensbrück were met with sights that defied comprehension. Emaciated survivors staggered toward them, their bodies bearing the scars of surgeries, injections, and experiments that had ravaged them for years. Piles of corpses filled courtyards, while hospital barracks reeked of infection and decay. In rooms that resembled clinics, soldiers discovered surgical tables still stained with blood, pressure chambers used for suffocation, and records filled with the names of the dead. For men hardened by battle, it was a different kind of trauma. The realization that science, a symbol of progress and healing, had been weaponized to torment the defenseless. The liberation of these camps did not just free prisoners, it exposed the grotesque depths of Nazi medical practices to the world. Shock and disbelief spread through the ranks, as soldiers realized that what they had uncovered was not only mass murder, but systematic torture carried out under the guise of medicine. The liberation of Dachau in April 1945 provided some of the most immediate and chilling evidence of medical atrocities. Soldiers discovered the infamous hypothermia tanks, where prisoners had been immersed in freezing water while Luftwaffe doctors timed their deaths. The high-altitude pressure chamber stood as another silent witness, its steel walls scarred by the final struggles of those trapped inside. Nearby hospital wards were filled with skeletal survivors bearing infected wounds deliberately induced for so-called research. Allied medics rushed to treat those they could save, only to find that many were beyond help, their bodies irreparably damaged by months or years of experimentation. In rooms piled with files, soldiers found meticulous records detailing each trial, each injection, each death. The precision of the documentation contrasted grotesquely with the chaos and pain endured by the victims. Liberation revealed not only the suffering of the living, but the calculated coldness of those who had inflicted it. The camp itself became evidence, every building, instrument and file telling a story of cruelty disguised as science. Dachau was not just a camp liberated, it was a laboratory exposed. At Buchenwald, Allied forces encountered another disturbing tableau of medical corruption. They discovered jars filled with human organs preserved in formaldehyde, remnants of experiments carried out on unwilling prisoners. Bones and tissue samples lined laboratory shelves, the remains of individuals reduced to specimens in grotesque displays of pseudoscience. In the camp infirmary, surgical instruments were scattered across blood-stained tables, alongside handwritten notes detailing experimental procedures. Survivors recounted being injected with poisons, forced to endure operations without anesthesia, and used as subjects for pharmaceutical trials. Soldiers recorded their testimonies, stunned by the casual cruelty described in such detail. The visual evidence was undeniable: bodies scarred by mutilations, children who had been test subjects, and the remnants of experiments that stripped away all pretense of healing. For the liberators, the realization that medicine had been weaponized so systematically was almost incomprehensible. Buchenwald became a museum of atrocities overnight, where every jar, every file, and every scar revealed the collapse of ethics under Nazi rule. The camp's liberation ensured that the world could no longer look away from what had been done in the name of science. Auschwitz, already synonymous with industrialized murder, revealed yet another layer of horror through its medical blocks. Here Allied soldiers and investigators uncovered the remains of Josef Mengele's twin experiments, where children had been dissected, compared, and catalogued. Small shoes and toys lay abandoned in rooms once used as makeshift laboratories, silent reminders of innocence stolen by the cold gaze of pseudoscience. Records unearthed in the camp detailed meticulous measurements of eye color, skull shape, and blood type, reflecting the obsessive racial studies carried out on Romani and Jewish prisoners. Survivors recounted being subjected to sterilizations, injections, and brutal operations that left them permanently disabled. The liberation of Auschwitz made clear that genocide and experimentation were not separate phenomena, but intertwined processes, each reinforcing the other. Photographs taken by soldiers captured skeletal survivors standing among the ruins of laboratories, their very existence testimony to the horrors inflicted. Auschwitz stood as the ultimate revelation of how far ideology could corrupt medicine, reducing healing into an instrument of destruction. Its liberation laid bare not only the crimes of extermination but the perversion of science itself. For the world beyond Europe, the shock came not only from survivor testimonies, but from photographic evidence captured by liberators. Soldiers, determined to ensure that no one could deny what they had seen, documented the atrocities in painstaking detail. Cameras recorded emaciated survivors, with numbers tattooed on their arms, surgical scars crisscrossing their bodies, and haunted eyes that bore witness to years of agony. They photographed instruments of experimentation, needles, scalpels, and chemical bottles, laid out alongside records that catalogued the dead. These images were distributed across newspapers, magazines, and newsreels, bringing the reality of Nazi medical crimes into homes around the world. For many civilians, the photographs were the first undeniable proof that rumors of atrocities were not exaggerations, but horrifying truth. The images became both evidence for trials and indelible symbols of cruelty, shaping public memory for generations. They revealed not only what had been done, but how carefully it had been concealed. Through the lens of cameras, liberation became exposure, ensuring that silence could not bury the crimes of Nazi medicine. The immediate response of Allied medical teams highlighted both compassion and helplessness in the face of overwhelming suffering. Doctors and nurses rushed to treat survivors, setting up makeshift hospitals in liberated camps. They battled infections, malnutrition, and psychological trauma, often improvising treatments with limited supplies. For some survivors, liberation came too late, as their bodies, ravaged by experiments and deprivation, could not recover. Medics reported being haunted by the cries of those they could not save, carrying the weight of loss alongside the urgency of healing. Yet even amid tragedy, survivors spoke of gratitude for the care offered, describing Allied doctors as the first figures of true healing they had seen in years. The contrast between Nazi doctors who had inflicted pain and Allied doctors who sought to alleviate it underscored the betrayal at the heart of the experiments. In these moments of treatment, the dignity of survivors was restored, even if only partially, reminding the world that medicine's true role is to heal. The liberation of camps was thus both an end to horror and the beginning of a struggle to restore life. The exposure of Nazi medical crimes after liberation sent shockwaves through the international community, forcing a reckoning with the darkest chapters of modern science. The documentation gathered by soldiers, photographs, survivor testimonies, and confiscated records became the foundation for post-war trials and for humanity's collective understanding of atrocity. What had once been hidden in secret laboratories was laid bare for the world, impossible to deny or diminish. The shock was not only at the scale of suffering, but at the realization that doctors, figures of trust and authority, had orchestrated such cruelty. The revelation demanded new questions. How could science, stripped of ethics, become indistinguishable from violence? How could society prevent such abuses from ever occurring again? Liberation had freed the survivors, but it had also liberated the truth, ensuring it could no longer be buried. The exposure of these crimes marked a turning point in history, where remembrance became an obligation and vigilance a necessity. The horrors revealed in 1945 still echo today, a reminder of the fragility of morality when ideology corrupts science. In the aftermath of World War II, the world turned its gaze to justice, and at the heart of this reckoning was the Doctors' Trial at Nuremberg. Convened in December 1946, it was one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials following the main proceedings against Nazi leaders. Here the men and women who had once worn white coats and wielded scalpels stood accused not as healers but as war criminals. 23 defendants, including prominent figures such as Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, and Wolfram Sievers, head of the SS's Medical Research Institute, were brought before an American military tribunal. They faced charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit atrocities through human experimentation. The courtroom in Nuremberg was transformed into a stage where the horrors of the camps were laid bare, not through rumor, but through evidence, documents, photographs, and survivor testimonies that revealed the perversion of medicine under the Third Reich. For the first time in history, doctors were judged not only by their patients, but by humanity itself. The trial symbolized a pivotal moment where healing had been betrayed and accountability was demanded. The prosecution presented evidence that was as methodical as it was devastating, meticulously piecing together the crimes committed in the name of science. Records seized from Dachau Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz revealed experiments in hypothermia, high-altitude decompression, sterilization, and poison, all conducted on prisoners without consent. Witnesses described being strapped into freezing tanks, injected with diseases, or mutilated on operating tables without anesthesia. Survivors' testimonies provided chilling first-hand accounts, transforming abstract charges into visceral realities. Charts, photographs, and instruments of experimentation were displayed before the tribunal, erasing any possibility of denial. The prosecutors emphasized that these acts were not the isolated work of rogue individuals, but part of a systematic state-sponsored program that fused ideology with medicine. They argued that the doctors had abandoned their sacred oath to heal, replacing it with a commitment to cruelty and obedience to the Nazi state. By placing these crimes within the framework of international law, the trial made clear that medicine could not be exempt from accountability. The evidence forced the world to confront the reality that those entrusted with life had instead orchestrated suffering and death. The defendants offered a variety of defenses, most of which revolved around obedience, necessity, and denial of responsibility. Many claimed they had merely followed orders, portraying themselves as cogs in a larger machine with no power to resist. Others argued that their experiments were justified by wartime necessity, claiming they sought to advance knowledge that could save German soldiers on the battlefield. Some attempted to discredit the testimonies of survivors, suggesting exaggeration or faulty memory. A few defendants even portrayed themselves as patriots, insisting their work was motivated by loyalty to the Reich rather than cruelty. Yet these defenses crumbled under the weight of evidence, as documents signed in their own hands revealed their active participation and initiative in designing experiments. Witness after witness contradicted their denials, recounting the suffering inflicted in vivid detail. The tribunal rejected the notion that following orders could absolve individuals of responsibility, establishing a principle that would resonate for decades. Obedience is no defense when human dignity is at stake. In Nuremberg, the doctors' excuses fell silent before the undeniable cries of their victims. The testimonies of survivors formed the emotional core of the trial, giving human faces to the atrocities hidden behind statistics and reports. Women from Ravensbrück described being sterilized and mutilated, their bodies scarred for life by surgeons who called it research. Men from Dachau recounted the agony of freezing experiments, their bodies convulsing as doctors timed their decline. Romani survivors testified about racial anthropology studies, where their children were measured, photographed, and eventually murdered for comparison. Each testimony shattered the illusion of scientific detachment, reminding the tribunal that every experiment involved a human being with a name, a family, and a future stolen. Survivors often broke down as they recounted their suffering, yet their courage in speaking gave voice to those who had perished. The tribunal listened in silence as these stories unfolded, the weight of truth pressing upon judges, prosecutors, and spectators alike. These testimonies did more than secure convictions. They restored dignity to the victims by ensuring their pain was acknowledged on the world stage. In Nuremberg, the voices of survivors turned silence into evidence and memory into justice. The verdicts delivered in August 1947 marked a turning point in the history of medicine, law, and human rights. Of the 23 defendants, 7 were sentenced to death, including Karl Brandt and Wolfram Sievers, while others received long prison sentences. A handful were acquitted, though even they remained stained by association with a system that had betrayed humanity. The tribunal declared that the crimes committed were not only against individuals but against civilization itself, setting a precedent for future trials of medical and scientific misconduct. The sentences underscored the principle that doctors are not exempt from accountability, even in times of war. Justice, though incomplete, had been served, offering some measure of closure to survivors and families of the dead. The execution of those found guilty symbolized society's rejection of medicine corrupted by ideology. The verdicts reverberated beyond Nuremberg, shaping the way the world would view ethics in science and the responsibilities of medical professionals. The trial ensured that the names of the perpetrators would be remembered not for their research but for their crimes. The Doctors' Trial also gave birth to one of the most important legacies in medical history, the Nuremberg Code. This set of 10 ethical principles laid the foundation for modern standards of human experimentation, emphasizing voluntary consent, the avoidance of unnecessary suffering, and the necessity of scientifically valid methods. For the first time, international law recognized that the rights of research subjects were paramount, outweighing the ambitions of science or the demands of the state. The Code became the cornerstone for subsequent ethical frameworks, influencing declarations such as Helsinki and shaping the oversight of clinical trials worldwide. It stood as a direct response to the horrors revealed at Nuremberg, a safeguard against the temptation to sacrifice individuals for supposed progress. The creation of the Nuremberg Code demonstrated that from atrocity could emerge a commitment to protection, ensuring that the victim's suffering would not be entirely in vain. Yet it also served as a reminder of how fragile ethics can be, requiring constant vigilance. The Code was both shield and warning, a monument to the victims inscribed not in stone but in principles. The international response to the Doctors' Trial reflected both shock and determination. Around the world, newspapers reported on the proceedings, broadcasting the chilling details of Nazi medical crimes to audiences still reeling from the war. The revelations shattered trust in the image of the doctor as healer, forcing societies to confront the dangers of authority corrupted by ideology. Universities, medical schools, and research institutions re-evaluated their practices, incorporating ethical training that drew directly from the lessons of Nuremberg. For survivors, the trial was both painful and vindicating, a moment when their suffering was publicly acknowledged and their voices amplified. For future generations, it became a symbol of the necessity of accountability, reminding doctors, scientists, and leaders that they serve not only knowledge, but humanity. The Doctors' Trial at Nuremberg was more than a courtroom proceeding. It was a global turning point. It transformed memory into law, atrocity into lessons, and silence into a pledge never again. The echoes of that courtroom still resonate today, challenging us to uphold the principles forged in the shadow of atrocity. Out of the ashes of atrocity, amid the revelations of cruelty exposed at the Doctors' Trial, emerged a framework that would reshape medicine and science forever: the Nuremberg Code, crafted in 1947 as part of the tribunal's verdict. The code was not a lengthy document filled with technicalities, but a concise set of 10 principles that carried the weight of moral necessity. At its core was the concept of voluntary consent, a principle so self-evident in its humanity, yet so often ignored in the pursuit of progress. The code insisted that no experiment could be justified without the willing participation of subjects, a direct response to the horrors of coerced trials conducted in the camps. It also emphasized the need to avoid unnecessary suffering, to use scientifically sound methods, and to prioritize the welfare of the individual over the ambitions of the researcher. These were revolutionary statements for their time, not because they introduced new ideas, but because they codified them as international law. In the shadow of Nuremberg, ethics became more than aspiration, it became obligation. The Nuremberg Code's insistence on informed consent was perhaps its most groundbreaking contribution. For centuries, medical practice had often assumed the authority of the physician over the patient, with little regard for autonomy. In Nazi Germany, this imbalance had been weaponized, transforming patients into prisoners and doctors into executioners. By placing voluntary consent at the very top of the code, the tribunal declared that autonomy was non-negotiable. Patients were not tools, not data points, and not vessels for experimentation. They were individuals whose rights and dignity must be respected. This principle resonated far beyond the courtroom, challenging traditional hierarchies in medicine. It demanded transparency, respect, and dialogue between doctor and patient, reshaping the culture of healthcare. For survivors of Nazi experiments, the principle of consent represented a form of justice, a safeguard that their suffering would never be repeated in the name of progress. The code ensured that never again could ignorance or coercion be disguised as medical necessity. Consent became the foundation of ethical medicine, a principle as vital as any scientific breakthrough. Beyond consent, the Nuremberg Code also articulated a vision of science that was bound by responsibility. It declared that experiments must be based on prior animal studies and a sound understanding of disease, ensuring that human beings were not subjected to reckless or speculative trials. It insisted that research must avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering, recognizing that the pursuit of knowledge could never justify cruelty. Importantly, it stated that experiments should be conducted only by qualified individuals, imposing accountability on professionals who wielded the power of life and death. Perhaps most striking was the code's assertion that subjects had the right to withdraw from experiments at any time, and that researchers were obligated to end trials if harm became evident. These provisions placed human welfare above scientific ambition, a radical departure from the culture of obedience and ideology that had characterized Nazi medicine. By writing these obligations into law, the code ensured that researchers could never again claim ignorance or inevitability. It enshrined responsibility as the backbone of scientific inquiry. The global impact of the Nuremberg Code extended far beyond the tribunal, influencing medical ethics and human rights on an unprecedented scale. Universities and medical schools began teaching the principles as part of curricula, ensuring that future doctors understood not only science but also morality. International organizations such as the World Medical Association drew upon the code when drafting their own guidelines, most notably the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which expanded upon its foundations. The United Nations, in its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, echoed its insistence on dignity and autonomy. Over time, the principles became embedded in the structure of modern medicine, shaping how clinical trials were designed, how patients were protected, and how research was reviewed. The code did not merely influence law, it transformed culture, embedding ethics into the heart of science. Its legacy can be seen today in every consent form signed by a patient, every ethics review board that evaluates research, and every protocol designed to safeguard participants. The code became a silent guardian, protecting lives through principles forged in horror. Yet the Nuremberg Code also revealed the fragility of ethics, for its very creation was born out of catastrophic failure. It demonstrated that the safeguards we take for granted are not inherent but must be consciously upheld. The code was both a guide and a warning, reminding future generations that science can easily slip into cruelty when unchecked. In the decades after its creation, controversies arose that tested its boundaries, from Cold War experiments in radiation exposure to debates over human testing in developing nations. Each scandal reignited the lessons of Nuremberg, reminding the world that vigilance is perpetual. The code's existence meant that violations could no longer be excused as ignorance, they could only be understood as betrayals. Its principles remain timeless, yet their application demands constant renewal, in an ever-changing world of medical and scientific advancement. The code was not the end of ethical challenges, but the beginning of an ongoing dialogue between progress and protection. Its greatest strength lies not in perfection, but in its ability to evolve while never forgetting its origins. For survivors of Nazi medical experiments, the Nuremberg Code stood as a vindication of their suffering. Many had testified at the doctors' trial, their voices trembling as they described the pain inflicted upon them. To see their words transformed into principles of international law was a form of justice, a guarantee that their torment had meaning beyond agony. Survivors often spoke of the importance of remembrance, insisting that the code was not merely legal text, but a memorial in principle. It acknowledged them not as subjects of failed science, but as individuals whose dignity demanded recognition. The code carried their experiences into the future, ensuring that every medical student, researcher, and physician would know the price of neglecting ethics. For survivors, it was not enough to punish the guilty, it was essential to protect the innocent yet to come. The Nuremberg Code achieved this, transforming pain into protection, testimony into law, and memory into responsibility. The Nuremberg Code remains one of the most enduring legacies of the post-war era, a beacon of morality forged in the crucible of atrocity. It teaches us that science cannot be divorced from humanity, that knowledge cannot come at the expense of dignity, and that progress without compassion is nothing more than regression. Its 10 principles, deceptively simple in form, carry the weight of countless lives lost to cruelty disguised as medicine. Each clause is both a rule and a remembrance, a promise written in the aftermath of horror that such crimes would never be allowed to repeat. As modern science advances into fields of genetics, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology, the code continues to echo, reminding us of the ethical foundations that must guide innovation. It is not merely a historical artifact, but a living document, as relevant today as it was in 1947. The Nuremberg Code endures as a testament to resilience, a safeguard for humanity, and a solemn tribute to those who suffered in the name of false science. Its voice continues to whisper through history, never again. As we close this journey through the history of Nazi medical experiments, we are left not with sterile facts or abstract numbers, but with the echoes of human suffering that must never be forgotten. Each victim was an individual with a name, a face, and a future erased by cruelty masquerading as science. Behind every chart, every instrument, and every report lay the beating heart of someone who once dreamed, loved, and hoped. Their voices, preserved through testimony, diaries, and memory, challenge us to look beyond the pages of history and confront the raw human cost. Remembering them is not an act of sentimentality, but of responsibility, for to forget is to risk repetition. These victims were not passive subjects. They were unwilling participants in an atrocity that betrayed the very essence of medicine. Their suffering reminds us that the healer's oath can be shattered when power replaces compassion. As history's witnesses, we inherit the duty to honor them not only with words but with vigilance. Memory becomes the first barrier against the silence where such horrors could be repeated. The moral responsibility of medicine, illuminated by these atrocities, demands that healing must always remain rooted in humanity. The Nazi doctors abandoned their oath, proving that knowledge without ethics leads not to progress, but to devastation. In their betrayal lies a warning that resonates through every hospital, clinic, and research lab today. Doctors are not merely technicians, they are custodians of life, entrusted with power that can heal or harm. To misuse that trust, as the Nazi physicians did, is to turn medicine into a weapon. Remembering this truth ensures that future generations of medical professionals understand that their responsibility extends far beyond science. It reaches into morality, dignity, and compassion. The lessons of this dark chapter remind us that ethical principles must never be treated as optional guidelines, but as immutable pillars of practice. Without them, the boundary between doctor and executioner can collapse, as it did in the camps. The responsibility of medicine is sacred, and the price of forgetting its sanctity has already been paid in blood. The importance of vigilance cannot be overstated, for history demonstrates how easily ethics can erode under pressure. In Nazi Germany, a respected medical community slid gradually into complicity, step by step, under the influence of ideology and ambition. Doctors who once swore to heal justified sterilizations, surgeries, and experiments by convincing themselves they served a greater cause. It is in this slow erosion of conscience that the greatest danger lies, for evil often wears the disguise of duty. Vigilance means questioning authority, resisting blind obedience, and recognizing when science begins to serve ideology rather than truth. It means creating systems of oversight, ethical review, and accountability that ensure no individual's dignity is sacrificed for ambition. The story of Nazi experiments reminds us that atrocities do not begin with gas chambers, but with small compromises rationalized by fear or opportunity. Eternal vigilance is not paranoia, it is the price of protecting humanity. In honoring the victims, we commit ourselves to safeguarding the ethical boundaries they were denied. Memory itself becomes a weapon of prevention, ensuring that the horrors revealed in Nuremberg do not fade into obscurity. Museums, memorials, and educational programs across the world preserve the stories of victims, transforming silence into testimony. Each photograph, each preserved artifact, and each recorded voice carries the weight of remembrance, reminding new generations of what was lost and why it must never be repeated. Survivors who spoke of their pain did so not to dwell on the past, but to warn the future. They entrusted us with their memories, and to neglect them would be to betray their courage. Memory serves not only as mourning, but as protection, shaping laws, ethics, and vigilance in the present. When we remember, we affirm that those who suffered did not do so in vain, that their lives contribute to safeguarding the dignity of those who come after. Forgetting, by contrast, would allow the cruelty of pseudoscience to resurface, unchallenged by history. In memory the victims live, and through remembrance, humanity builds resilience against repetition. The legacy of the Nazi experiments is also a call to humility, a reminder of how fragile the line between progress and atrocity truly is. Science, when guided by compassion, can heal and transform the world, but when it is stripped of ethics, it becomes indistinguishable from violence. The doctors of the Third Reich were not monsters in appearance. They were educated, respected, and celebrated in their time. Their fall into atrocity reveals that anyone given the wrong circumstances and unchecked power can betray humanity. The lesson is not only to condemn them, but to recognize within ourselves the capacity for complicity. Humility demands that we approach science with caution, aware that ambition can blind and ideology can corrupt. This awareness transforms remembrance into responsibility, ensuring that the line between healing and harming is never blurred again. The victims teach us that progress without morality is regression, and that every experiment must be weighed not only by what it discovers, but by what it preserves, the dignity of life. The world today continues to grapple with the lessons born of this horror, applying them to fields of research that the Nazi doctors could not have imagined. Genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and biomedical innovation all carry immense potential but also profound ethical risks. Each breakthrough forces us to ask questions of consent, dignity, and responsibility, questions rooted in the lessons of Nuremberg. The Nuremberg Code, born from atrocity, whispers through every ethical debate, reminding us of its origins in pain. Its principles are not relics of the past, but living safeguards for the present and future. Every time a researcher seeks consent, every time a review board scrutinizes a protocol, the voices of the victims echo through the room. Their suffering ensures that the pursuit of progress is no longer divorced from conscience. The legacy of the Nazi experiments thus stretches into the very core of modern science, reminding us that memory is not passive, it actively shapes the world we continue to build. In the end, remembering the horror is not only about the past, but about the choices we make today and tomorrow. The victims of Nazi medical experiments call out across history, not only for justice, but for vigilance, compassion, and remembrance. Their pain demands that we guard the integrity of medicine, that we resist the seduction of ideology, and that we place humanity at the center of every scientific pursuit. Memory is their gift to us, a warning etched in scars, testimonies, and graves. To honor them is to ensure that their suffering becomes the foundation of a better future. As the documentary closes, we are left with a solemn responsibility to carry their stories forward, to teach, to remember, and to act with conscience. In doing so, we transform horror into lesson, memory into protection, and suffering into resilience. The victims are not forgotten, for their voices now live in the ethical codes that guide us, in the memorials that honor them, and in the vigilance of those who remember. Their legacy is our duty, and their memory is our safeguard.